Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The trees whispered secrets as I stumbled through the undergrowth, my heart pounding in sin with my frantic footsteps. I was lost, hopelessly lost, and the fading light only amplified my growing panic. That's when I saw it, a glimmer of hope in the form of a small cabin, its windows glowing with warm, inviting light. Little did I know crossing that threshold would plunge me into a nightmare far worse than being lost in the woods. I'd always prided myself on my sense of direction and outdoor skills. Hiking was my escape, my way of disconnecting from the chaos of everyday life. But today something had gone terribly wrong. Maybe it was the new trail I decided to explore, or perhaps I'd been too caught up in my thoughts to pay attention to my surroundings. Whatever the reason, as the sun began to dip below the tree line, I found myself in unfamiliar territory with no idea how to get back to my car. My phone was useless, no signal this deep in the forest. The map I brought was soaked through from an unexpected rainstorm earlier in the day, the ink running in blues and greens that no longer resembled any discernible path, as darkness crept in. The forest seemed to come alive with sounds that sent shivers down my spine, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush, and the ominous crack of branches that sounded far too heavy to be caused by any small animal. That's when I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. At first, I thought I was imagining things, my mind playing tricks on me in my desperate state. But as I moved closer, the glow solidified into the unmistakable shape of windows, a cabin. My heart leapt with relief. Civilization, help! I practically ran towards it, branches whipping at my face and arms. But I didn't care. All I could think about was getting inside, calling for help, and ending this nightmare of a hike. As I burst into the small clearing where the cabin stood, I took a moment to catch my breath and take in my surroundings. The cabin was small and rustic, its log exterior weathered by years of exposure to the elements. A thin trail of smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth and comfort. Inside, the windows glowed with soft yellow light that spilled onto the overgrown grass surrounding this structure. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, almost too perfect to be real. I approached the door, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. My hand hesitated for just a moment before I knocked three sharp raps that seemed to echo in the quiet of the forest. For a long moment, there was no response, and I felt a flicker of fear. What if no one was home? What if I'd imagined the whole thing? But then I heard movement inside, the creak of floorboards, and the door swung open. The man who stood there was not what I expected. He was tall and lean, with a wild mane of gray hair and a beard that reached nearly to his chest. His eyes, a startling blue, seemed to pierce right through me. Well, he said, his voice rough, as if from disuse. What do we have here? I stumbled over my words, suddenly feeling foolish and intrusive. I'm so sorry to bother you, sir. I got lost on a hike, and I saw your cabin. I was hoping I could use your phone to call for help. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might slam the door in my face. But then his expression softened, and he stepped back, gesturing for me to enter. Coming, can't leave you out here in the dark. Can I? Relief washed over me as I stepped inside. The cabin was small but cozy, with a crackling fire in the stone fireplace and shelves lined with books and odd trinkets. The man bustled about, pulling out a chair at the small wooden table. Sit, he insisted. You look half frozen. Let me get you something warm to drink. I sank into the chair gratefully, the warmth of the fire already beginning to seep into my chilled bones. Thank you so much, Mr. Gus, he said, filling a kettle with water. Just call me Gus. As Gus busied himself making tea, I took the opportunity to look around the cabin more closely. It was cluttered but clean, every surface covered with an eclectic mix of items. Old books with cracked spines sat next to delicate glass figurines. A collection of antique clocks ticked softly, each keeping its own time. And everywhere, there were photographs, faded sepia-toned images of people and places I didn't recognize. You have quite a collection, I said, trying to make conversation. Have you lived here long? Gus chuckled, a low rumbling sound. Oh, longer than you believe, my dear. This forest and I were old friends, he said, a steaming mug of tea in front of me, the aromatic steam curling up invitingly. I wrapped my hands around it, savoring the warmth. It's beautiful out here, I said, but I can't imagine living so far from everything. Don't you get lonely? Something flashed in Gus's eyes there, and gone so quickly. I almost thought I'd imagined it. Lonely? No, I have everything I need right here. He gestured around the cabin, and sometimes, like tonight, the forest brings me company. I sipped mine tea, a strange herbal blend that tasted of earth, and something I couldn't quite place about that phone call. Ah yes, Gus said, settling into the chair across from me. I'm afraid I don't have a phone out here. Never saw the need for one. My heart sank. Oh, I see. Well, could you perhaps point me in the direction of the nearest town? I could try to make it there in the morning. Gus leaned back, stroking his beard thoughtfully. The nearest town? Well, now, that's quite a trek. Wouldn't be safe for you to attempt it on your own, especially not after a night in the woods. No, I think it's best if you stay here tonight. I can guide you out in the morning. I felt a flicker of unease. Stay the night with this stranger, but as I glanced out the window at the pitch-black forest beyond, I knew I didn't have much choice. The thought of stumbling around in the dark, possibly getting even more lost, was terrifying. That's very kind of you, I said, forcing a smile. If you're sure it's not too much trouble. No trouble at all, Gus said, his blue eyes twinkling. It's not often I get visitors. It'll be nice to have some company. As the night wore on, my initial unease began to fade. G was a fascinating conversationalist, full of stories about the forest and its history. He spoke of old legends of spirits that roamed the woods and secrets hidden in the very trees themselves. I found myself drawn and leaning forward to catch every word, but as captivating as his tales were, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way his eyes never seemed to leave me, watching my every move with an intensity that made my skin crawl, or perhaps it was the way he deflected any questions about his own past, always turning the conversation back to me, probing for details about my life, my family, my reasons for being in the forest. As midnight approached, I began to feel drowsy. My limbs felt heavy, and my thoughts were fuzzy around the edges. Gus noticed my drooping eyelids and stood up. You must be exhausted, my dear. Let me show you where you can sleep. He led me to a small room off the main living area. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall, covered in a patchwork quilt. It's not much, Gus said apologetically, but it should be comfortable enough for one night. I thanked him, fighting to keep my eyes open. As soon as he left, closing the door behind him, I collapsed onto the bed. Despite my lingering unease, exhaustion won out, and I quickly fell into a deep sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke with a start, my heart racing. Something had pulled me from my slumber, but I couldn't pinpoint what. The room was pitch black, the silence oppressive. I lay there for a moment, straining my ears, when I heard it, the soft creak of a floorboard just outside my door. My breath caught in my throat. Was Gus checking on me, or the thought I'd been pushing away all night surfaced with terrifying clarity? What if he had more sinister intentions? I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out the faint outline of the door. The handle turned achingly slow, and I felt panic rise in my chest. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. My hand closed around something solid, a heavy book from the bedside table. I gripped it tightly, my palm sweaty As the door began to open, a sliver of light appeared widening. As the door swung inward, I tensed, ready to spring, when a voice called out. Softly, "Are you awake, my dear? I thought I heard you stirring." It was Gus, his silhouette framed in the doorway. I relaxed my grip on the book, feeling foolish. "Yes, I'm awake," I said, hoping he couldn't hear the tremor in my voice. "Is everything okay?" "Oh yes," Gus said, stepping into the room. "Everything is just fine. I was just thinking it's such a beautiful night. Perhaps you'd like to join me for a walk in the middle of the night." Every instinct I had screamed that this was wrong, that I needed to get out of there. But as I opened my mouth to decline, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't move my limb. Felt unresponsive. Gus moved closer, and in the dim light, I could see that his eyes were no longer twinkling with warmth. They were cold, calculating, filled with a hunger that made my blood run cold. "You see," he said, his voice low and menacing, "it gets so lonely out here. But the forest, she provides, she brings me company like you, and in return I give her offerings." I tried to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. As Gus reached for me, his fingers unnaturally long and sharp, I realized with sickening clarity that I had walked right into a trap. The cabin that had seemed like salvation was anything but, and the nightmare I thought I'd escaped was only just beginning. The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was Gus's voice, soft and almost tender, as he whispered, "Don't worry, my dear, you'll be part of the forest forever now, and I'll never be alone again." The engine sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving me stranded in a sea of darkness. The headlights flickered once, twice, then extinguished completely, as if the night had swallowed them whole. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white with tension. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was alone on this desolate country road, miles from anywhere, with no cell service and a dead car. Little did I know my night was about to get much worse. I'd been driving for hours, making my way back from a business trip that had dragged on far longer than expected. The GPS had suggested this back road as a shortcut, promising to shave an hour off my journey. Now, as I peered into the impenetrable darkness beyond my windshield, I cursed my decision to trust that disembodied voice for a moment. I just sat there listening to the tick of the cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees that lined the road. I fumbled for my phone, squinting at the bright screen. No service, of course, and the battery was dangerously low. "Okay," I muttered to myself, trying to stay calm. "Think, Mark, what are your options?" I could stay with the car and hope someone drove by, but I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least an hour. I could try to fix the problem myself, but my mechanical skills were limited to changing a tire, and this seemed far beyond that. The only real option was to start walking and hope. I found help with a deep breath. I grabbed my jacket from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something wild and unfamiliar. I shivered, zipping up my jacket and wishing I'd packed something warmer. I used my phone's flashlight to check under the hood, more out of a sense of obligation than any real hope of fixing the problem. As expected, everything looked normal to my untrained eye. With a sigh, I closed the hood and locked the car. At least my insurance would cover a tow if I ever managed to call them. I started walking, my phone's flashlight creating a small bubble of light around me. The road stretched out ahead, disappearing into darkness on either side. Dense woods pressed close, their branches reaching out like garroted fingers. Every rustle and snap made me jump, my imagination populating the shift shadows with all manner of threats. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I heard it, the low rumble of an engine in the distance. Relief flooded through me. Finally, another car. I turned, waving my arms and flashing my light, ready to flag them down. The vehicle came into view, its headlights cutting through the darkness It was a truck, old and battered. From what I could see, it slowed as it approached, and for a moment, I felt a surge of gratitude, but as it drew level with me, instead of stopping, it just crawled along, matching my pace. I couldn't see the driver through the glare of the headlights, but something about the situation made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Hello, I called out, my voice sounding thin and uncertain in the night air. My car broke down a ways back. Could you help me? No response. The truck just continued to creep along beside me, its engine idling. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. This wasn't right. Why weren't they stopping? Why weren't they saying anything? I picked up my pace, and the truck matched it. My heart began to race, panic clawing at my chest. I was exposed out here, vulnerable. There was nowhere to run except into the woods, and the thought of plunging into that darkness was almost as terrifying as the silent truck beside me. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. If you can't help, that's fine. I'll just keep walking. Still no response, just the low rumble of the engine and the crunch of gravel under tires. I walked faster, almost jogging now. The truck kept pace effortlessly. My breath came in short gasps, fear and exertion taking their toll. What did they want? Why were they toying with me like this? Suddenly the passenger window rolled down. Hope and dread whirred within me as I turned, expecting to finally see the driver, to hear an explanation for this bizarre behavior. But the cab was empty. I stumbled, nearly falling in shock. How was this possible? The truck was clearly moving, keeping pace with me, but there was no one behind the wheel. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. That's when I heard it, a low rasping chuckle coming from the empty cab. It was a sound that didn't belong to any human throat, a noise that sent icy fingers of terror down my spine. I ran, I sprinted down the road, my legs pumping furiously, driven by pure animal fear. The truck's engine roared, and I could hear it speeding up behind me. In desperation, I veered off the road, plunging into the woods. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear the truck on the road keeping pace. How was it following me through the dense forest? I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, I collapsed behind a large tree, gasping for breath. I couldn't hear the truck anymore. Had I lost it? I peered around the trunk, straining my eyes in the darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own labored breathing and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then a twig snapped nearby. I held my breath, pressing myself against the rough bark of the tree. Another snap, closer this time. Something was moving through the woods, heading straight for me. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and oddly misshapen. As it drew nearer, I realized with horror that it wasn't a person at all, but some kind of creature. It walked on two legs, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, nearly dragging on the ground, and its head was elongated, almost canine in appearance. It sniffed the air, and I knew with sickening certainty that it was tracking me. I had to move, had to run, but fear had frozen me in place. The creature's head swiveled in my direction, and I found myself staring into eyes that glowed with an unnatural yellowish light. A low growl rumbled from its throat, a sound that vibrated in my very bones. In that moment, survival instinct overrode my paralysis. I bolted, no longer caring about the noise I made behind me. I could hear the creature giving chase, its heavy footfalls and ragged breathing drawing ever closer. I burst out of the woods and back onto the road, my feet pounding against the asphalt ahead. I could see lights, my car somehow, in my panic-fueled flight. I had circled back to where I started. I reached the car, yanking at the door handle in desperation. It was locked, of course. It was locked. I had locked it myself. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my keys. The creature emerged from the woods, its eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. It loped towards me with an unnatural gait, covering the distance between us with terrifying speed. Just as its clawed hand reached for me, I managed to unlock the car I dove inside, slamming the door shut mere inches from the creature's snapping jaws. It hurled itself against the car, rocking it violently. I could hear its claws scraping against the metal, see its twisted face pressed against the window. Saliva dripping from its fanged mouth. With trembling hands, I tried the ignition, praying for a miracle. The engine turned over once, twice, and roared to life. I didn't question this sudden reversal of fortune. I threw the car in drive and slammed my foot on the accelerator. The tires squealed as I peeled away, the creature's howl of rage fading into the distance. I drove like a madman, taking turns too fast, constantly checking the rear view mirror for any sign of pursuit. It wasn't until I reached the highway with its comforting street lights and occasional passing car that I began to relax. As the adrenaline wore off, my mind struggled to make sense of what had happened. The truck with no driver, the creature in the woods, it all seemed impossible, like something out of a nightmare. But the scratches on my arms from the branches, the mud on my shoes, and the deep gouges in the car's paint told me it had all been terrifyingly real. I drove straight through until morning, not daring to stop until I was far, far away from that lonely country road. As the sun rose, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, I found myself wondering if I would ever be able to drive at night again, or if the darkness would forever hold the memory of glowing eyes and the sound of an empty truck. One thing was certain, I would never take another shortcut again. Sometimes the long way around is the safest path. After all, the first sign that something was terribly wrong was the blinking red light. It caught my eye as I was changing for bed. A tiny pinprick of crimson nestled in the corner of the rustic wooden beams above. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a reflection from my phone perhaps, but as I stared, a chill crept down my spine. That light shouldn't be there, and if it was what I thought it was, our romantic getaway had just taken a sinister turn. Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months. Both of us were swamped with work, our relationship strained by long hours and constant stress. This secluded cabin in the mountains seemed like the perfect escape. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just us and nature. A chance to reconnect and rekindle the spark that had brought us together in the first place. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the towering pines that surrounded the property. The cabin was everything the pictures had promised, a cozy two-story log structure with a wraparound porch and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. "Oh, Tom, it's perfect," Sarah exclaimed as we lugged our bags inside. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and I felt a surge of pride at having found this place. It had been a bit more expensive than we'd initially budgeted for, but seeing the joy on her face made it all worth it. We spent that first evening exploring the cabin and its surroundings. There was a small lake just a short hike away, its surface like glass in the fading light. Inside the cabin was a perfect blend of rustic charm and modern comfort. A massive stone fireplace dominated the living room, and the kitchen was equipped with high-end appliances that seemed almost out of place in the woodland setting. As night fell, we curled up on the plush sofa, a crackling fire warming the room. Sarah nestled against me, her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in months, I felt the tension begin to leave my body. "This was such a good idea," she murmured, her fingers intertwined with mine. "I can't remember the last time I felt this relaxed." I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "Me too. We should do this more often." We stayed like that for hours, talking, laughing, reminiscing about the early days of our relationship. It felt like we were rediscovering each other, peeling away the layers of stress and responsibility that had accumulated over the years. When we finally made our way upstairs to the bedroom, the mood was charged with a playful energy we hadn't experienced in far too long. As Sarah disappeared into the bathroom to freshen up, I flopped onto the king-size bed, marveling at how comfortable That's when I saw it, the red light barely noticeable at first, but once I'd spotted it. Impossible to ignore. I sat up squinting at the ceiling. It had to be my imagination, right? But as I stood on the bed, for a closer look, my blood ran cold. It was unmistakably a camera lens, the red light indicating it was active and recording. Tom, what are you doing? I nearly fell off the bed at the sound of Sarah's voice. She stood in the bathroom doorway, wrapped in a towel, her brow furrowed in confusion. There's a camera, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Up there in the corner. Sarah's eyes widened as she followed my gaze. What? No, that can't be right. Are you sure? I nodded grimly. I'm sure. And it's on. The playful mood from earlier evaporated, instantly replaced by a sickening mix of violation and fear. Sarah clutched her towel tighter, as if suddenly aware of her vulnerability. We need to check the rest of the cabin, I said, jumping down from the bed. If there's one camera, there might be more. We spent the next hour combing every inch of the cabin. Our search revealed our worst fears. There were cameras everywhere, in the living room, hidden in the eye of a mounted deer head, in the kitchen disguised as part of the coffee maker, even in the bathroom, tucked behind the vanity mirror. Oh God, Sarah whispered, sinking onto the couch. Who would do this? Why? I paced the room, my mind racing. I don't know. But we can't stay here. We need to leave now. Sarah nodded, her face pale. Should we call the police? I pulled out my phone, cursing under my breath. No service. Remember, that's why we chose this place. We'll have to drive until we get a signal. We threw our belongings haphazardly into our bags, constantly glancing over our shoulders, painfully aware of the hidden eyes watching our every move. As I tossed the last of our things into the car, a thought struck me. Wait here, I told Sarah, ignoring her protests. As I ran back into the cabin, I found what I was looking for in the kitchen, a notepad and pen left for guests to use, scrawling a hasty note. I held it up to the camera. I knew was hidden in the coffee maker. We know about the cameras. We're leaving and calling the police. Back in the car, I gunned. Engine gravel sprang as we peeled out of the driveway. Sarah clutched the dashboard, her knuckles white. What if they try to stop us? She asked, her voice trembling. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, scanning the road ahead. They won't. They can't risk exposing themselves. But even as I said it, doubt flooded me. Who were they? The owners, some sick voyeur who had hacked the cabin security system. And what if they decided we knew too much? We had been driving for about 20 minutes, the cabin long out of sight. When Sarah's phone chimed, she jumped at the sound, fumbling to unlock the screen. We have service, she said, relief evident in her voice. I'm calling 911. As she spoke to the dispatcher, I kept my eyes on the road, hyper aware of every shadow, every curve. The dispatcher advised us to keep driving until we reached the nearest town, where we could meet with local law enforcement. We drove in tense silence after Sarah hung up, both lost in our own thoughts. The events of the night played on a loop in my mind, each replay revealing new terrifying possibilities. Tom, Sarah said suddenly, her voice tight with fear. Look, I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt my heart skip a beat. A pair of headlights had appeared behind us, closing the distance rapidly. It's probably nothing, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Just another car on the road. But as the vehicle drew closer, sir, I knew it wasn't just another car. It was gaining on us too quickly, its high beams flooding our car with harsh light. Hold on, I warned Sarah, pressing the accelerator to the floor. The car lurched forward, engine roaring, as we took the winding mountain road at dangerous speeds. But our pursuer matched our pace, effortlessly staying right on our tail. Sarah fumbled with her phone. No signal. Again, she said, panic edging into her voice. Tom, what are we going to do? I didn't answer, all my concentration focused on keeping us on the road. The headlights behind us suddenly swerved, pulling alongside us. It was a large black SUV, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't make out the driver for a moment. We were side by side, our fate balanced on a Knife's edge, then the SUV swerved towards us, metal screeching as it scraped along the side of our car. Sarah screamed as I fought to maintain control, the steering wheel jerking violently in my hands. The SUV pulled back only to ram us again, harder this time. We were approaching a sharp bend in the road, a sheer drop-off visible just beyond the guard rail. The SUV was positioning itself for another hit, one that would surely send us over the edge. In that moment, time seemed to slow. I saw the determination in Sarah's eyes as she braced herself against the dashboard. I felt the car's tires lose grip as we entered the curve too fast, and I made a decision. Just as the SUV started its final charge, I slammed on the brakes, our car fishtailed tires screaming in protest, but we managed to stay on the road. The SUV, caught off guard by our sudden deceleration, shot past us, unable to correct its course in time. We watched in horror as the SUV smashed through the guardrail and sailed into the darkness beyond. There was a moment of eerie silence, then the sound of twisting metal and shattering glass as it tumbled down the mountainside. Sarah and I sat in stunned silence, our ragged breathing the only sound after what felt like an eternity. I put the car in drive and slowly pulled away from the scene. We drove straight to the police station in the nearest town, our stories spilling out in a rush of adrenaline and fear. The officers were skeptical at first, but a quick check confirmed that the cabin was indeed rigged with hidden cameras. As for the SUV and its driver, a search of the area where it went off the road turned up nothing, no vehicle, no body. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. In the days that followed, as we gave statements and dealt with insurance claims, Sarah and I clung to each other, finding solace in the shared trauma. The authorities never did find out who was behind the cameras or who had chased us that night. We never did take another vacation in a secluded cabin, but in a strange way the experience brought us closer together. We had faced our worst fears and survived our bond stronger for having weathered the storm together. Still to this day, I can't help but scan every room I enter for hidden cameras, and sometimes late at night, I swear I can see a tiny red light blinking in the darkness, always watching the first rays of dawn filter through the canopy, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. As I unzipped my tent, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Something was different, wrong. The once familiar was now felt alien, threatening, and there, carved into the bark of the nearest tree, was a symbol I'd never seen before, intricate, unsettling, and unmistakably fresh. I had always been a solitary person, finding more comfort in the quiet of nature than in the chaos of human interaction. That's why solo camping trips were my escape, my way of recharging. This particular expedition was meant to be a week-long trek through one of the most remote areas of the national forest. No cell service, no other campers, just me and the wilderness. The first 2 days had been perfect. I'd hiked deep into the back country, setting up camp in a small clearing near a bubbling stream. The solitude was exactly what I needed, a chance to clear my head and escape the pressures of my everyday life. But now, staring at that strange symbol, all sense of peace evaporated. I approached the tree cautiously, my fingers tracing the edges of the carving. It was deep, the wood still damp with sap. This hadn't been here when I'd set up camp the night before. A twig snapped somewhere in the undergrowth, and I whirled around, my heart pounding. The forest suddenly seemed alive with hidden threats, every shadow concealing potential danger. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to rationalize the situation. It was probably simply just an animal, maybe another hiker who'd passed through in the night. But as I scanned the area around my campsite, my blood ran cold. The symbol wasn't just on one tree, it was everywhere. Every tree surrounding my small clearing bore the same intricate carving, forming a perfect circle around my tent. Panic clawed at my throat. This was no coincidence, no random act of vandalism. Someone or something had been here. while I slept, meticulously marking the trees. And for what purpose? I dove back into my tent, fumbling for my backpack. My hands shook as I pulled out my compass and map, desperate to orient myself and find the quickest way back to civilization. But as I unfolded the map, my breath caught in my throat. There, inked onto the paper in what looked horribly like blood, was the same symbol that surrounded my camp. A low rhythmic chant drifted through the trees, so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it, but it grew steadily louder, coming from all directions at once. The words were in no language I recognized, guttural and ancient sounding. I abandoned any thought of packing up camp, grabbing only my backpack and water bottle. I burst out of the tent, my eyes darting wildly around for the source of the chanting. The forest seemed to have come alive, the trees looming closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I had no idea if I was going in the right direction, but I knew I had to get away from that clearing, away from those symbols and that terrifying chant. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my lungs burning with each gasping breath. The chanting followed me, always just behind, always drawing closer no matter how fast I ran. Faces seemed to appear in the bark of the trees, twisted and mocked. More symbols flashed past, carved into every surface, each one filling me with a deep primal dread. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish flight through the forest. My legs ached, my lungs screamed for air, but still I pushed on, driven by pure animal fear. Finally, I burst through a line of trees and found myself on the edge of a small lake. The sudden openness was jarring after the claustrophobic density of the forest. For a moment, the chanting seemed to fade, and I allowed myself a flicker of hope. Maybe I'd outrun them, whoever or whatever they were. But as I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath, I saw it there, reflected in the still surface of the lake, was a sight that turned my blood to ice. Figures stood at the tree line behind me, dozens of them, their bodies oddly elongated and misshapen. They wore robes of bark and leaves, their faces hidden behind masks carved to resemble the symbols I'd seen on the trees. I straightened slowly, afraid to turn around, afraid to confirm what I was seeing in the lake's reflection. The chanting had stopped, replaced by an expectant silence that was somehow even more terrifying. Child of the outside world, a voice spoke, ancient and rasping like dead leaves skittering across stone. You have trespassed in our domain. I turned, my whole body trembling. The figure stood motionless at the edge of the forest, an impenetrable line of living shadows. The one who had spoken took a step forward, its mask a nightmare of swirling patterns that seemed to move and shift as I watched. I'm sorry, I managed to croak out, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. I'll leave, I promise. Just please let me go. The figure tilted its head, an unnaturally fluid motion that sent shivers down my spine. Leave, it said, amusement coloring its inhuman voice. Oh no, child, you cannot leave. The forest has chosen you. You are part of it now. The other figures began to move forward, spreading out to encircle the lake shore. I backed away, water lapping at my heels. My mind raced, searching desperately for a way out. But I knew, with sickening certainty, that I was trapped. What do you want from me? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The lead figure raised its arms, the sleeves of its robe falling back to reveal hands that were more like twisted branches than flesh. We want what the forest wants: new life, new blood, a new vessel for the old magic. As if on cue, the other figures began chanting again, the sound rising and falling like waves. I felt a strange sensation in my feet and looked down to see tendrils of moss creeping up my legs, rooting me to the spot. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. With a cry of desperation, I tore myself free from the grasping moss and plunged into the lake. The water was shockingly cold, stealing the breath from my lungs, but I forced myself to keep moving, swimming with all my might towards the center of the lake behind me. I could hear splashing As the figures entered the water, their chanting never ceasing even as they pursued me, I didn't dare look back. Focusing all my energy on putting distance between myself and those terrifying beings, my arms burned with exhaustion, my water-logged clothes dragging me down. But still I swam. The far shore seemed impossibly distant, but it was my only hope. As I struggled through the water, I became aware of something moving beneath the surface. Long, sinuous shapes glided past my kicking feet, and several times I felt something brush against me, scales rasping against my skin. Just as my strength was about to give out, my feet touched bottom. I staggered onto the shore, coughing and gasping, but there was no time to rest. I could see the figures still coming, gliding through the water. With unnatural speed, I turned and ran once more into the forest, my wet clothes clinging to me every step, a monumental effort. But this time something was different. The trees seemed to part before me, creating a clear path. Was I imagining it, or were the branches reaching out to help me, propelling me forward? I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor. As consciousness slipped away, I had the strangest sensation of being cradled, of roots and branches enveloping me in a protective embrace. When I awoke, I was lying on the outskirts of the forest, the sounds of a nearby highway reaching my ears. My clothes were dry leaves and twigs tangled in my hair. Had it all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by isolation and exhaustion? But as I staggered to my feet, I saw it there. On the inside of my wrist was a small symbol exactly like the ones I'd seen carved into the trees. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and I knew with chilling certainty that my ordeal had been all too real. I made my way to the highway and flagged down a passing car, grateful beyond words for the return to civilization. But even as I settled into the passenger seat, I could feel the forest calling to me. The symbol on my wrist tingled, a constant reminder of what I'd experienced. I never went camping again after that, but sometimes in my dreams I hear that chanting, and I wonder if one day the forest might call me back to finish what had started. The moment I saw his thumb outstretched, I knew I should have driven past. Something in his stance, the way his eyes gleamed in my headlights, set off alarm bells in my head. But it was raining, the kind of downpour that turns the world into a gray smear, and I couldn't bring myself to leave him standing there. I pulled over, my windshield wipers beating a frantic rhythm. As he climbed into my car, I had no idea that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. I've always considered myself a good judge of character. It's a skill you develop when you spend as much time on the road as I do. As a traveling salesperson, I've crossed this stretch of highway more times than I can count. I've seen all types out here, families with broken down cars, fellow salespeople hitching a ride between towns, the occasional drifter looking for a fresh start. I thought I'd seen it all. But this guy, he was different. He slid into the passenger seat, bringing with him the scent of rain and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Thanks for stopping, he said, flashing me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Not many people would in this weather. No problem, I replied, pulling back onto the empty highway. Where are you headed? Just up the road a ways, he said vaguely, his gaze fixed on the rain-slicked asphalt ahead. I'll let you know when to drop me off, I nodded, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my stomach. We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady thrum of rain on the roof and the swish of the wipers. I snuck glances at him when I could. He was younger than me, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. His clothes were nondescript jeans, a dark jacket, but they looked expensive, at odds with someone hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere. So I said, desperate to break the silence, what brings you out here on a night like this? He turned to look at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes were pale, almost colorless in the dim light of the car. Car trouble, he said simply. Broke down a few Miles back, that's rough. I sympathized. Did you call for a tow? No phone. He shrugged. Besides, I prefer to handle things on my own. Something about the way he said it made me grip the steering wheel tighter. I tried to steer the conversation to safer ground. I'm Emily, by the way, I offered. He was quiet for a moment, and I wondered if he was going to respond at all. Finally, he said, John, nice to meet you, Emily. As we continued down the highway, John began to ask me questions. At first, they seemed innocent enough, where I was from, what I did for a living, but as the conversation progressed, I realized he was probing for more personal information. He asked about my family, my relationships, even my daily routine. You sure seem interested in my life, I said, trying to keep my tone light despite the growing knot of anxiety in my chest. John smiled, that same smile that didn't reach his eyes. I find people fascinating, he said. Everyone has a story, don't they? I nodded, unsure how to respond. The rain had started to let up, and I found myself wishing it would pour again, if only to fill the increasingly uncomfortable silence. That's when he said something that made my blood run cold. You know, Emily, he said casually, as if commenting on the weather, I've always wondered what it would be like to live in a house like yours, with a big oak tree in the front yard, and the wind chimes on the porch. I felt my heart skip a beat. I'd never mentioned anything about my house. How could he possibly know these details? What are you talking about? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. John turned to me, his pale eyes gleaming in the darkness. Oh, come on, Emily, don't play coy. I know all about you, your house at 1542 Maple Street, your cat Milo, who likes to sleep on the window. So the way you always leave your bedroom window crack open, even on cold nights. My mind reeled. This was impossible. There was no way he could know these things unless... Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking. How do you know all this? He laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. I told you, Emily, I find people fascinating, especially people like you, so trusting, so willing to help a stranger. I felt sick. This stranger I had led into my car had been watching me for how long? Days, weeks. The thought made me dizzy with fear. I think you should get out now, I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I began to slow the car, but John's hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength. Oh, I don't think so, he said, his voice low and menacing. We're just getting started, you and I yanked my arm free, swerving the car. As I did so, get out, I shouted, panic rising in my throat. John's demeanor changed. In an instant, gone was the calm, collected stranger, his face contorted with rage, and he lunged at me, trying to grab the steering wheel. I fought back, struggling to maintain control of the car. As we careened down the highway, rain had started to fall again, making the road slick and treacherous. We wrestled for control, the car swerving wildly across the empty lanes. In the chaos, I managed to slam on the brakes. The car fishtailed, spinning across the wet asphalt. I saw John's eyes widen in surprise. Just before we hit the guardrail, the impact was deafening. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and I felt a searing pain in my side. As I was thrown against the door, then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the rain. It was pouring again, drumming on the crumpled roof of the car. I was slumped against the steering wheel, my whole body aching. As I slowly lifted my head, wincing at the pain, I remembered what had happened. John, the first turn to the passenger seat, my heart racing. It was empty. The door was open, rain pelting the torn upholstery. There was no sign of him. With shaking hands, I unbuckled my seat belt and stumbled out of the wreckage. The guardrail was bent and twisted where we'd hit it, but it had kept us from plunging down the steep embankment beyond. I looked around wildly, expecting to see John's body thrown from the car, but there was nothing. He was gone. I limped to the middle of the road, rain soaking through my clothes, and looked in both directions. The highway stretched out empty and dark in both directions. There was no sign of John, no indication that he had ever been there at all. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain in my side intensified. I lifted my shirt to find an angry bruise blooming across my ribs. I needed help. I made my way back to the car, praying my phone had survived the crash. By some miracle, it had. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. The wait for help was agonizing. Every sound made me jump, convinced that John was going to emerge from the darkness to finish what he'd started, but no one came. When the police and ambulance finally arrived, I told them everything about picking up the hitchhiker, the things he knew about me. The struggle in the car. They searched the area, but found no trace of John, no footprints leading away from the crash, no blood, nothing at the hospital. As the doctors patched me up, the police questioned me again. They were skeptical of my story. How could a man simply vanish from a crash site? And if he had been stalking me, as I claimed, why was there no evidence of it at my home? I began to doubt myself. Had I imagined it all? Was it possible that the stress of my job, the loneliness of the road, had caused me to hallucinate the entire encounter? But then, as I was being discharged, a young officer looked uncomfortable, glancing around, as if afraid of being overheard. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm not supposed to tell you this, but you're not the first. We've had reports over the years, drivers picking up a hitchhiker who knows things he shouldn't, who causes accidents, who vanishes without a trace." I felt a chill run. I whispered. The officer shook his head. "I don't know, nobody does. But be careful out there. And maybe don't pick up any more hitchhikers." I nodded, speechless. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put the incident behind me. I installed a security system in my house, changed my routines, even considered finding a new job that didn't require so much travel. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes late at night, I think I see a figure standing under the street light outside my house, a man with pale, colorless eyes. But when I look again, he's gone. I don't know if John was real, or if he was some kind of supernatural entity, or if he was simply a product of my imagination. But one thing's for certain, I'll never stop for a hitchhiker again, and I always check my rearview mirror just in case I see a thumb outstretched on the side of the road. The shortcut was supposed to save me time. Instead, it led me into a nightmare I couldn't have imagined in my darkest dreams. As I drove down that narrow, unfamiliar street, the shadows seemed to deepen, the houses grew more dilapidated, and an overwhelming sense of wrongness settled in my gut. I should have turned back then, but I kept driving, unaware that with each passing second I was sealing my fate. It had been a long day at the office, one of those soul-crushing days where nothing goes right and everyone seems to be against you. I was exhausted, irritable, and desperate to get home to my apartment. Needed a glass of wine when my GPS suggested a new route, one that would shave 15 minutes off my usual commute. I didn't think twice about accepting it at first. The neighborhood seemed normal enough, older homes, sure, with paint peeling and yards a bit overgrown, but nothing too out of the ordinary for this part of the city. But as I drove deeper into the maze of streets, things began to change subtly. The street lights, which should have been flickering to life in the gathering dusk, remained dark. The few cars I saw parked along the curb were old models covered in a thick layer of dust, as if they hadn't moved in years. And the people, where were the people? No one was out walking dogs, no children playing in yards. The entire neighborhood seemed deserted. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. My GPS chirped, instructing me to turn left onto a street named Shadowwood Lane. Even the name sent a shiver down my spine. As I made the turn, the houses seemed to press in closer, their windows dark and vacant, like empty eye sockets staring down at me. The trees lining the street were gnarled, and twisted their branches reaching out over the road like grasping fingers. That's when I saw them people, but not like any people I'd ever seen before. They emerged from the shadows between houses, from behind trees, even seeming to materialize out of thin air. Men, women, children, all moving with an unnatural gliding gait. Their faces were pale, almost translucent in the fading light. And their eyes, God, their eyes were wrong, too large, too dark, focused intently on my car. As I drove past, my heart began to race, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I needed to get out of here now. I pressed down on the accelerator, but my car didn't respond. The engine sputtered and conked, and to my horror, I felt the vehicle begin to slow. Panic clawed at my throat as I pumped the gas pedal frantically. But it was no use. The car rolled to a stop in the middle of the street. For a moment, there was silence. I sat there, my breathing loud in the stillness of the car, watching as the strange people began to approach. They moved slowly, almost leisurely, as if they had all the time in the world, as if they knew I wasn't going anywhere. I tried to start the car again, turning the key with shaking hands. The engine made a pitiful whining noise, but refused to turn. Over my phone, I could call for help, but when I grabbed it from the cup holder, the screen was black dead. I hadn't noticed the battery draining, but now it was useless. A tap on my window made me jump. I turned to see a face pressed against the glass inches from my own. It was a woman, or something that looked like a woman. Her skin was so pale, it was almost translucent. Blue veins visible beneath the surface. Her eyes were huge, pitch black, with no whites visible. She smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. Car trouble? She asked, her voice muffled through the glass, but still sending chills down my spine. It was too high, too sweet, like a parody of a real voice. I shook my head, unable to speak more. Them had gathered around my car now, their dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel like a butterfly pinned to a board. You should come out, another voice said, this one belonging to a man standing near my rear bumper. And it's not safe to stay in there. A hysteric laugh bubbled up in my throat. Not safe in here as opposed to out there with them. No thank you, I managed to croak out. I'm fine, I'll just wait for help. The woman's smile widened, stretching her face in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Oh, but we are the help, she said. We've been waiting for you. A chill ran through me at her words. Waiting for me? How was that possible? I'd never been to this neighborhood before. Never even knew it existed until my GPS led me here. As if reading my thoughts, the woman's hand moved to the door handle. Don't worry about how or why, she said softly. Just know that you're home now. You're where you belong. The door lock clicked open of its own accord. I scrambled to hit the lock button, but it was no use. As soon as I locked it, it would unlock again. Panic overwhelmed me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I climbed into the back seat, pressing myself against the opposite door. They were opening the driver's side door now, reaching in with those too long, too pale hands. I fumbled with the handle of the back door, my sweaty fingers slipping on the metal, just as I felt a cold hand grasp my ankle. The door gave way, and I tumbled out onto the pavement. I didn't think, I just ran. My legs pumped furiously as I sprinted down the dark street, the sound of my ragged breathing loud in my ears. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps unnaturally quiet, but somehow still audible over the pounding of my heart. Houses flew by in a blur as I ran, each one looking more decrepit and wrong than the last. The trees seemed to bend towards me, their branches reaching out as if trying to snatch me up. I took random turns, left, right, left again, hoping to lose my pursuers in the mesquite streets. But no matter how fast I ran, how many turns I took, I could still feel them behind me. Their presence was like a physical weight on my back, growing heavier with each step. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw it. A gap between two houses leading normal street. Beyond, street lights glowed warmly, and I could see cars moving in the distance. Safety normally. With a final burst of speed, I lunged for the gap. As I passed between the houses, I felt something tug at my clothes, heard a hiss of frustration behind me. But then I was through, stumbling onto a well-lit sidewalk. I turned, half expecting to see my pursuers emerging from the darkness. But the gap I'd just run through was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the brick seamless and weathered as if it had been there for decades. I stood there, gasping for breath, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. People walked past me on the sidewalk, giving me curious looks, but otherwise paying me no mind. Cars drove by, their headlights illuminating the normal busy street. It was as if the nightmare neighborhood had never existed in a day. Days, I managed to flag down a taxi and give the driver my address. As we drove through familiar streets, I tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. Had it been real, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion, some kind of elaborate prank? But deep down, I knew the terror had been too real, the strangeness too profound to be anything but true. Somehow, I had stumbled into a place I wasn't meant to be, a place that wanted to keep me. When I got home, I immediately pulled up maps on my computer, searching for any trace of Shadowwood Lane or the twisted neighborhood I'd driven through, but there was nothing. According to every map, every city record, that area was just a normal residential zone, indistinguishable from any other in the city. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to put the incident behind me. I changed my route home, avoiding even the possibility of driving near that area again. I threw myself into work, into social activities, anything to keep my mind occupied. But sometimes late at night, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a pale face peering in through my window. Gone when I turn to look, or I'll be driving and suddenly realize the street signs don't look familiar. The house is a little too dark, and still in those moments my heart races, and I'm back there running for my life through those shadowy streets. And I wonder, did I really escape, or are they still out there waiting patiently for me to take another wrong turn, to find my way back to the place they say I belong? I don't know if I'll ever have the answers, but one thing's for certain: I'll never trust a shortcut again. The sound that woke me wasn't loud, it was just a faint creak, the kind old houses make as they settle. But in the oppressive silence of that enormous empty home, it might as well have been a gunshot. I lay there, heart pounding, straining my ears for any other noise. That's when I heard it again, a soft thud followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the attic above. I hadn't wanted to take this babysitting job in the first place. The Hendersons' house was on the outskirts of town, a sprawling Victorian mansion that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. But the pay was good, and at 17, I needed all the money I could get for college. When I arrived earlier that evening, Mrs. Henderson had given me a quick tour. The place was a maze of rooms and hallways filled with antique furniture and creepy old paintings, but it was the locked door at the end of the upstairs hallway that really caught my attention. "Oh, that just leads to the attic," Mrs. Henderson had said dismissively when she caught me looking. "It's full of junk, no need to go up there now." Lying in the dark guest room, those words echoed in my mind. If the attic was locked, where were those footsteps coming from? I grabbed my phone from them nightstand, its screen casting a faint blue glow in the darkness. 2:37 a.m. The Hendersons weren't due back for hours. Another creak closer this time. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the plush carpet. Part of me wanted to run, to get out of the house and never look back, but I couldn't leave the kids. 11-year-old Tyler and 6-year-old Emma were sleeping down the hall, blissfully unaware of the terror gripping my heart. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The hallway beyond was silent, but I could feel a change in the air, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Something was wrong, very wrong. Taking a deep breath, I turned the doorknob and peered out into the hallway. Moonlight filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything looked normal. but the feeling of wrongness intensified. I tiptoed down the hall, checking on the kids. They were both sound asleep. Tyler sprawled across his bed, Emma clutching her favorite stuffed animal. I closed their doors, quietly, not wanting to wake them. That's when I saw it at the end of the hallway. The door to the attic was open, my breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, staring at the rectangle of darkness that yawned before me. How was this possible? The door had been locked. I'd seen Mrs. Henderson try to handle herself as I watched, paralyzed with fear. A shadow moved across the opening. Something was up there, moving around in the attic. I should have woken the kids. I should have gotten them out of the house. But curiosity, that dangerous, irresistible force, propelled me forward. I had to know what was up there. Each step towards the attic door felt like an eternity. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I winced at each sound, sure that whatever was up there would hear me coming. But the noises from the attic continued, oblivious to my approach. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The darkness beyond seemed absolute, impenetrable. I fumbled with my phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a narrow staircase leading up. I took the first step, then another. The stairs groaned under my waist, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet house. At the top I paused, sweeping my light across the attic. It was a vast space, the ceiling following the slope of the roof. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight. The air was thick and stale with an underlying scent I couldn't quite place, something musty and organic, like old leaves or damp earth. Piles of boxes and old furniture created a maze of shadows. As my light played across the room, I caught glimpses of odd shapes, a cracked mirror here, a weathered trunk there, but nothing seemed out of place. Nothing moved. I was about to turn back to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing when I saw it in the far corner of the attic, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a door that shouldn't exist given the layout of the house. My feet moved of their own accord, drawing me closer to that impossible door. It was old, the wood warped and stained with age. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, curves and lines that hurt my eyes to look at directly. As I stood before it, my hand reached out almost against my will. My fingers brushed the rough wood, tracing one of the bizarre symbols. The door swung open. Beyond was not the outside of the house, as logic dictated there should be. Instead, I found myself staring into a room. No, not a room, a chamber. The walls were rough stone, glistening with moisture. Roots and vines snaked across the ceiling, pulsing slightly, as if alive. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, a slab of black stone that seemed to absorb the light from my phone. And on that altar, I stumbled back, a scream lodged in my throat. What I saw defied explanation, defied reality itself. It was a shape, a form that shifted and went, never settling into anything recognizable. One moment, it seemed, was a mass of tentacles and eyes, then something else entirely, something my mind couldn't or wouldn't comprehend. As I watched, frozen in horror, the thing on the altar turned towards me. I felt its attention, like a physical weight, crushing and invasive. It saw me, it knew me. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, taking the attic stairs 3 at a time, not caring about the noise I made. I burst into the hallway, ready to grab the kids and flee the house. But the hallway wasn't there. I found myself in a long stone corridor identical to the chamber I had just fled. The same roots crawled across the ceiling, the same moisture glistened onto the walls. And at the end of the corridor, another door waited, its surface carved with those maddening symbols. Panic clawed at my throat. This wasn't possible. I was still in the house. I had to be, but as I turned, I saw that the attic door had vanished. There was only smooth stone where it had been. A sound echoed down the corridor, a wet, slithering noise that set my teeth on edge. It was coming closer. I ran again, this time towards the door at the end of the corridor. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what new horror waited beyond, but I had no choice. As my hand touched the handle, I heard a voice, no, not a voice, a thought pushing its way into my mind. Welcome home, it said in a language that was not language, in a tone that was not sound, but pure distilled meaning. We've been waiting for you. I woke up screaming. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the guest room. I was tangled in the sheets, drenched in sweat. For a moment, I just lay there, my heart racing, trying to convince myself it had all been a dream. But then I saw it. There on my hand was a symbol, one of the strange, eye-hurting shapes I had seen carved into that impossible door. It stood out against my skin, dark and crisp, as if it had been tattooed there. A knock at the door made me jump. Hello, Mrs. Henderson's voice called out. Is everything all right in there? I stared at the symbol on my hand, my mind reeling. What had happened last night? What was real? And what was dream? Everything's fine, I managed to call back, my voice shaky. I'll be out in a minute. As I got dressed, I tried to make sense of it all. The symbol on my hand was undeniably real. But the rest, the attic, the door, the thing on the altar, it couldn't be real, could it? I made my way downstairs where the Henderson and the kids were having breakfast. Everything seemed normal. Sunlight filled the kitchen, the smell of coffee and bacon hanging in the air. Tyler and Emma chattered excitedly about their plans for the day. Did you sleep well? Mr. Henderson asked as he handed me a cup of coffee. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I raised the cup to my lips, I caught Mrs. Henderson staring at my hand, at the symbol. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew she knew what had happened. She had known all along. We should talk, she said quietly, her smile never wavering. After breakfast, as I sat down at the table, a chill ran down my spine. What had I stumbled into, and more importantly, how was I going to get out? The symbol on my hand seemed to pulse, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The GPS chirped cheerfully, announcing our arrival at our destination. But as I looked out the car window, my heart sank. This couldn't be right. Instead of the quaint bed and breakfast we booked for our family vacation, we found ourselves on the outskirts of a town that looked like it had been frozen in time. Faded storefronts line the empty main street, their windows dark and uninviting. A sense of unease settled over me as I realized our technology had led us astray, guiding us to a place that felt more like a ghost town than a tourist destination. Dad, where are we? My daughter Sarah asked from the back seat, her worry. I forced a smile, trying to hide my own growing concern. Just a little detour, sweetheart. I'm sure we'll find our way soon. My wife Lisa shot me a skeptical look. She knew me too well to be fooled by my false bravado. Maybe we should turn around, she suggested quietly. This doesn't feel right, but something compelled me to press on. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the strange allure of the abandoned-looking town. Either way, I made a decision that would change our lives forever. Let's just ask for directions, I said, pulling the car to a stop in front of what appeared to be a general store. I'm sure someone can point us in the right direction. As we stepped out of the car, the silence hit me like a physical force. There were no birds singing, no distant hum of traffic. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving the air unnaturally still. The bell above the store's door jangled discordantly as we entered, the sound echoing in the empty street. Inside, the store was dimly lit and cluttered. Shelves stocked with dusty cans and boxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. An old man stood behind the counter, his weathered face impassive. As he watched us approach, "Can I help you folks?" he asked, his voice growly and low. I explained our situation, showing him the address of the bed and breakfast on my phone. As he looked at the screen, a flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, fear. It was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. "Ah, yes," he said slowly. "I know the place, but you won't be able to get there tonight. Roads washed out from the storm last week." I frowned. "What storm?" "The weather's been clear for days." The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Maybe where you come from Things are different here. Before I could question him further, he continued, there's a hotel in town, only place you'll find to stay tonight 2 blocks down, can't miss it. Something about his tone made me uneasy. But what choice did we have? It was getting late, and the kids were tired from the long drive. We thanked the old man and left. The bells, discordant jangle following us out the hotel was indeed impossible to miss. It was a looming Victorian structure, its paint peeling and windows dark. As we approached, I could have sworn I saw a curtain twitch in one of the upper windows. But when I looked again, all was still. The lobby was musty and dimly lit, decorated with faded floral wallpaper and an antique furniture that had seen better days. A thin, pale woman stood behind the desk, her fingers tapping in a regular rhythm on the worn. Would we need a room for the night? I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman's lips curved into what might have been a smile. Of course, we've been expecting you. A chill ran down my spine. Expecting us, but we just decided to stop here. She waved her hand dismissively. Oh, you know, always expecting visitors in a town like this, not many come through. But when they do, she trailed off, her eyes gleaming in the low light. We were given a key, an actual metal key, not a key card, and directed to our room on the 3rd floor. The elevator was out of order, so we trudged up the creaking stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Our room was large but oppressive, with heavy drapes and dark with furniture. The kids huddled together on one of the beds, their earlier excitement replaced by quiet apprehension. It's just for one night, Lisa said, trying to sound reassuring, but I could see the worry in her eyes. As we settled in for the night, strange noises kept us on edge, footsteps into past our door, whispers that sounded just on the edge of comprehension, and once a long low moan that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. None of us slept well that night. The next morning we were eager to leave, but as we stepped out of the hotel we were met with a sight that stopped us in our tracks. The town was different. The empty storefronts now bustled with activity. People in oddly old-fashioned clothing hurried along the sidewalks. A horse-drawn carriage clattered down the street. What's going on? Sarah asked, her eyes wide. Is this some kind of festival? I shook my head, unable to form words. This wasn't just a festival. Somehow overnight we had stepped into a different time. We made our way back to the general store, hoping to find answers. The old man was there, looking exactly the same as he had the day before. What's happening? I demanded. What is this place? He guarded us calmly, as if our panic was an everyday occurrence. This is Emile Haven, he said simply. And your home now? Home? Lisa echoed, her voice rising. This isn't our home. We need to leave. The old man's expression hardened. Nobody leaves Millhaven. Not really. You might think you've gone, but you'll always find your way back. The town calls to its own. A crowd had begun to gather outside the store. Their faces were friendly, welcoming even, but there was something off about their smiles, something hungry. We ran back to our car, which thankfully still started. As we peeled out of town, I could see the people of Millhaven in the rear view mirror. They didn't chase us, they just stood there watching, as if they knew something we didn't. For hours we drove in silence, the events of the past day too strange to process. It wasn't until we crossed the state line that we began to relax, to believe that we had truly escaped. But our relief was short-lived. As night fell and fatigue set in, I realized we needed to stop. Up ahead I saw lights. A small town. We'll stop here for the night, I said, pulling off the highway. As we drove down the main street, a sense of deja vu washed over me. The storefronts looked familiar. The hotel loomed ahead, its Victorian silhouette unmistakable in the gathering darkness. Impossible. We had driven for hours. We were in a different state, but there was no denying it. We were back in Millhaven. The old man's words echoed in my mind. Nobody leaves Millhaven. Not really. As we sat in the car staring at the town that had somehow called us back, I realized the truth of his words. We were home now, and home, it seemed, would never let us go. In the days and weeks that followed we tried to leave countless times, but no matter which direction we drove, no matter how far we went, we always ended up back in Millhaven. The town existed in some sort of loop, a pocket of reality that bent the rules of time and space. We learned to adapt to live in this place that was both wonderful and terrifying. The town's people welcomed us with open arms, teaching us their ways, showing us the magic that thrummed just beneath the surface of everyday life. Sarah and Tommy grew to love it here, reveling in the freedom to explore a town where time had no meaning. Lisa found purpose in the town's library, cataloging books that contained knowledge from every era. As for me, I took over the general store when the old man decided it was time to move on, whatever that meant. In a place like this, I became the gatekeeper, the one who welcomed new arrivals, seeing the same fear and confusion in their eyes that I once had. Sometimes late at night, I still dream of the world we left behind. I wonder if time is passing there, if anyone has noticed our absence. But then, I wake to the sound of horses' hooves on cobblestone streets, to the sight of gas lamps flickering in the perpetual twilight, and I remember this is home. Now Millhaven, the town that called Falls to its own, the place where lost souls find their way. And as I open the store each morning, ready to greet whatever travelers might stumble upon our little pocket of unreality, I can't help but smile. After all, everyone finds their way to Millhaven eventually. It's just a matter of time. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into my new home was the smell. It wasn't the musty odor of an old house or the chemical scent of fresh paint. No, this was something else entirely, a sickly sweet aroma that seemed to seep from the very walls. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a product of nerves and excitement. After all, this was supposed to be a fresh start, but as I would soon learn, in this house, nothing was ever quite what it seemed. I'd bought the place on a whim, really. After my divorce, I needed a change of scenery, somewhere to rebuild my life. When I saw the listing for the old Victorian on the outskirts of town, it seemed perfect. Sure, it needed some work, but that was part of the appeal, a project to keep my hands and mind busy. The realtor had been oddly eager to close the deal, practically shoving the keys into my hand the moment the paperwork was signed. I should have seen it as a red flag, but I was too caught up in the thrill of new beginnings to notice that first night I barely slept. The house creaked and groaned, settling into itself like a living thing. But it was more than that. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that eyes were following me from room to room in the light of day. I tried to laugh it off. Old houses had character, I told myself, that's why I bought it. After all, I threw myself into cleaning and repairs, determined to make the place mine own. It was while I was stripping wallpaper in the upstairs hallway that I found the first oddity behind a particularly stubborn section of paper. I uncovered a small door no bigger than a shoe box. It was locked, the keyhole old and rusted. Curiosity got the better of me. I spent the better part of an hour trying various keys I'd found around the house, but none fit. Finally, frustrated, I decided to force it open. The wood splintered easily under the pry bar, revealing a small dark space beyond reaching, and my fingers brushed against something soft. I pulled it out, heart racing with anticipation. It was a doll, old and worn, its porcelain face cracked and one eye missing, but it was the expression on its face that sent a chill down my spine, a twisted grimace that seemed more like a silent scream than a smile. I should have gotten rid of it then and there, but something stopped me. Instead, I placed it on a shelf in my bedroom, telling myself it was just a piece of the house's history. That night the dream started. I found myself wandering the halls of the house, but everything was wrong. The proportions were off, doorways too tall and narrow, staircases twisting at impossible angles, and everywhere I turned I saw those dolls, hundreds of them, their cracked faces, all wearing that same horrible expression. I woke in a cold sweat, the sweet smell stronger than ever as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I Saw something that made my blood run cold. The doll I'd found was no longer on the shelf. It sat at the foot of my bed, its one remaining eye fixed on me. I told myself I must have moved it in my sleep, that the dream had confused my memories. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Over the next few weeks things escalated. Objects would move when I wasn't looking. I'd hear footsteps in empty rooms, childlike laughter echoing through the halls. And always, that sickly sweet smell grew stronger. I tried to ignore it, to rationalize it away. I was just stressed. I told myself the isolation of living alone in a big old house was getting to me. But I couldn't ignore the way the air seemed to thicken when I entered certain rooms, or the shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. It was the discovery in the attic that finally forced me to confront the truth. I'd been avoiding the attic, telling myself it was just because I hadn't gotten around to cleaning it yet. But one night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn there. The pull was undeniable. Like a siren's call, the attic door opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. As I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight, I was hit by a wave of that sweet smell, so strong it made me gag. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw them, dolls, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, covering every surface they hung from them. Raptors sat in neat rows on shelves spilled out of old trunks and boxes, and every single one had that same twisted expression, that silent scream. But it was the far corner of the attic that drew my attention. There, partially hidden behind a stack of old furniture, was a door that, according to the house's layout, shouldn't exist. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run from this house and never look back. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. The door swung open easily, revealing a small dark room beyond. And there, in the center of the room, was a rocking chair. It moved slowly back and forth, creaking soft ly, though there was no breeze to move it. As I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminated the figure in the chair. It was a doll, larger than the others, almost the size of a child. But this one was different. Its face wasn't frozen in that horrible grimace. Instead, it smiled, a wide, knowing smile that seemed to grow as I watched. And then it opened its eyes. I don't remember much of what happened next. I have flashes running down the stairs, the sound of childlike laughter all around me, the feeling of small hands grabbing at my clothes. Somehow, I made it out of the house, my car peeling out of the driveway. As those laughing voices faded behind me, I drove all night, not stopping, until I was 3 states away. I left everything behind, my clothes, my possessions, my dreams of a fresh start. None of it mattered. I just had to get away. It's been years now, and I've never gone back. I've tried to move on, to forget about that house and what I saw there. But sometimes late at night, I catch a whiff of that sickly sweet smell, and in my dreams, I still see the doll in the rocking chair, its eyes opening to reveal the darkness within. I know now that some houses are never truly empty. Some have histories, secrets that cling to the walls and seep into the very foundations. And sometimes those secrets are best left undiscovered. I often wonder about the family that moved in after me. Did they experience the same things? Did they uncover the truth hidden in the attic? Or did the house choose to stay silent, being its time until the right person came along? I'll never know for sure. But one thing I do know, I'll never buy an old house again. Some fresh starts come at too high a price, and some doors, once open, can never truly be closed again. As for the doll, well, I try not to think about it, but sometimes in the corner of my eye, I swear I see a small porcelain face watching me, waiting, and I wonder if maybe I didn't leave everything behind after all. Maybe, just maybe, a piece of that house came with me, ensuring that I'll never truly escape the horror I uncovered. So, if you're ever house hunting and come across a beautiful old Victorian that seems too good to be true, take my advice, walk away. Some bargains aren't worth the cost, and some houses are hungry for more than just your money. They want your soul, and they're patient enough to wait until you willingly give it to them. I've always been a light sleeper, but that night something jolted me awake with a force I'd never experienced. Before my eyes snapped open, heart racing, every nerve on high alert, the digital clock on my nightstand glowed an eerie 3:33 a.m. As I lay there trying to calm my breathing, I heard it, footsteps slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom, but that was impossible. I lived alone, forcing myself to remain still. I strained my ears, listening intently. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. The handle turned slowly, the hinges creaking as the door swung open. I held my breath, eyes wide in the darkness, as a figure stepped into my room. Even in the dim light filtering through the curtains, I could make out the intruder's silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with an eerie familiarity. As the figure approached my bed, moonlight fell across its face, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. I was staring at myself. Not a reflection, not a twin, but me, exactly as I looked at that very moment, down to the old t-shirt and boxers I wore to bed. The doppelganger eyes met mine, and I saw my own terror reflected back at me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear. The other me just stood there staring, its expression unreadable. Then slowly, its lips curved into a smile that was anything but friendly. "Hello, Mark," it said, my own voice echoing back at me. "We need to talk." I found my voice, then a strangled whisper escaping my throat. "Who, what are you?" The thing that looked like me tilted its head, considering I'm you, of course, or rather I'm the you that could be the you that should be. I shook my head, trying to clear it. This had to be a dream, a nightmare. I'd wake up any second now, laugh it off, and go about my day. But the weight of the other me sitting on the edge of my bed felt all too real. "This isn't a dream, Mark," it said, as if reading my thoughts. "I'm here because you've been waiting, wasting your potential, squandering the life we could have had." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" The doppelganger eyes hardened. "Look at you, stuck in a dead-end job, no girlfriend, no ambition. Do you know what I've accomplished? The life I built." As it spoke, images flashed through my mind. I saw myself, no, the other me, in a corner office shaking hands with important-looking people. I saw a beautiful house, a loving family, awards and accolades, everything I'd ever dreamed of, but had been too afraid to pursue. "That could have been you," the other me continued, "but you let fear hold you back. Every time you had a chance to take a risk, to reach for something better, you chose the safe path. And look where it's gotten you." Anger flared within me, pushing back the fear. "You don't know anything about my life," I spat. "You're not real. You're just some manifestation of my insecurities, or something." The doppelganger laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "Oh, I'm very real, Mark, and I'm here to take what should have been mine." Before I could react, it lunged forward, hands wrapping around my throat. I struggled, gasping for air, my fingers clawing at the arms that felt exactly like my own. But the other me was stronger, its grip unyielding as black spots danced in my vision. I felt a strange pulling sensation. It was as if my very essence was being drained away, flowing into the creature that wore my face. I saw flashes of my life, childhood memories, first kisses, moments of triumph and failure, all being absorbed by this thing that claimed to be a better version of me. With the last of my strength, I managed to wrench one of its hands away from my throat. Gulping in air, I croaked out, Why are you doing this?" The doppelganger paused, its grip loosening slightly. "Because I deserve it," it hissed. "I made the hard choices, took the risks. I became everything you were too scared to be, and now I'm taking the life that should have been mine all along." In that moment of hesitation, I saw my chance. I bucked upwards, throwing the creature off balance. We tumbled to the floor, grappling in the darkness. I felt its fists connecting with my face, tasted blood in my mouth, but I fought back with a desperation I'd never known before. As we struggled, I caught glimpses of the life it had shown me, the success, the family, the achievements but I also saw the cost, the long hours, the compromised values, the relationships destroyed in the pursuit of success. Was that really the life I wanted? No, I gasped finally. Pitting the doppelganger beneath me, that's not who I am, that's not who I want to be. The other me snarled, its face contorting with rage. You're weak, it spat, you'll never amount to anything. I tightened my grip, staring into eyes that were mirror images of my own. Maybe not, I said, but at least I'll be true to myself. As I spoke those words, something shifted. The doppelganger form began to shimmer, becoming less solid beneath my hands. It thrashed and screamed, its voice distorting into something inhuman. I held on, watching in horrified fascination as it seemed to dissolve, breaking apart into wisps of shadow that dissipated into the air. And then suddenly it was gone. I was alone in my room, sprawled on the floor, my heart pounding and my body aching from the fight. For a long moment, I just lay there trying to process what had happened. Had it all been a dream, a hallucination? But the bruises forming on my skin and the metallic taste of blood in my mouth told me it had been all too real. Slowly, I picked myself up off the floor and stumbled to the bathroom. The face that stared back at me from the mirror was my own, battered, scared, but undeniably me. There was no sign of the other, better version of myself. As the adrenaline wore off, I was left with a profound sense of not peace exactly, but acceptance. The doppelganger had shown me a version of my life that on the surface seemed perfect, but it wasn't my life. It wasn't the path I had chosen for myself. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on the encounter more and more. Had it been some sort of supernatural event, a physical manifestation of my own self-doubt and regret, or simply a vivid nightmare that had left very real marks? I may never know the true nature of what happened that night, but one thing was certain: it had changed me, not in the dramatic, life-altering way the doppelganger had attempted, but in smaller, more meaningful ways. I started taking more chances at work, speaking up in meetings, pitching ideas I would have previously kept to myself. I rekindled old friendships I'd let fade and made an effort to form new ones. And most importantly, I learned to appreciate the life I had built for myself, imperfect as it might be sometimes. Late at night, I still find myself glancing nervously at my bedroom door, half expecting to see that other version of myself standing there. But the fear is tinged with something else now: gratitude for the wake-up call, for the chance to reaffirm who I am and who I want to be. We all have paths, not taken versions of ourselves we could have been, but that night taught me that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Sometimes the best version of yourself is the one you choose to be, day by day, decision by decision. As for the doppelganger, well, I like to think it's still out there somewhere in some parallel universe, living that other life, and I hope it's happy. But I'm glad that in this reality I'm the one who gets to be me. The walls seemed to breathe a subtle in and out motion that made my stomach churn. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the decrepit hallway of the abandoned asylum continued its eerie pulsation. My friends, oblivious to the nightmarish sight, pushed deeper into the building's bowels. As I hesitated, a chill ran down my spine. We'd come looking for thrills, but I was beginning to realize we'd stumbled into something far more sinister, and escaping might not be as simple as walking back out the way we came. It had all started as a dare. Really, the five of us, Mike, Sarah, Jess, Alex, and myself, had been swapping urban legends over beers when Mike brought up the old Ravenscroft Asylum on the outskirts of town. Abandoned for decades, it had a reputation for being severely haunted. Locals whispered about strange lights, unearthly screams, and unlucky explorers who went in but never came out. We should check it out, Mike had said, his eyes gleaming with the particular bravado that comes after a few drinks tonight. Unless you're all chicken. I should have said no, we all should have, but caught up in the moment, fueled by liquid courage. and the desire to prove ourselves we piled into Mike's beaten-up Jeep and headed for Ravenscroft. The asylum loomed before us, a hulking silhouette against the star-studded sky. Its windows were dark, empty sockets in a face of crumbling brick. As we approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was watching us, assessing our worth as potential victims. Last chance to back out, Sarah had whispered, her voice betraying a nervousness she was trying hard to hide. But Mike was already moving forward, flashlight in hand, and the rest of us followed like sheep to the slaughter. The interior of Ravenscroft was a maze of decaying corridors and rooms filled with the remnants of its dark past, rusted gins, ancient medical equipment, and graffiti-covered walls told the story of decades of abandonment. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of rot. At first, it was almost disappointing. We crept through the halls, jumping at shadows and our own echoing footsteps, but nothing truly scary materialized. Mike led the way, his bravado growing with each empty room we explored. See, nothing to worry about, he declared, swinging his flashlight in a wide arc. Just a bunch of old ghost stories. That's when things started to go wrong. It began subtly, a door slamming shut behind us, though there was no breeze, the sound of footsteps. When all of us were standing still, a child's laughter echoing from a distant corridor. Hunky's just said, her voice trembling, maybe we should go back. But as we turned to retrace our steps, we found ourselves facing an unfamiliar hallway. Somehow, without realizing it, we had become turned around in the labyrinthine building. No problem, Alex said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We'll just find another way out. That's when I first noticed the walls, the subtle movement, like the building itself was alive and breathing. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was just a trick of the light. But the motion continued, growing more pronounced with each passing second. Do you guys see that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They all turned to look, and I saw the moment realization dawned on their faces. The color drained from Mike's cheeks, his earlier bravado evaporating like mist in sunlight. What the hell? Sarah breathed, reaching out to touch the undulating wall. As her fingers made contact, she jerked back with a yelp. Its warm panic began to set, and we started moving faster, our earlier caution forgotten in the face of this impossible, terrifying phenomenon. Corridors twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the asylum's hard doors that should have led to exits opened onto more hallways or rooms filled with unspeakable horrors, operating theaters with blood-stained tables, padded cells with claw marks on the walls. And all the while, the building seemed to be coming alive around us. The walls pulsed faster, the floor beneath our feet becoming soft and yielding like walking on flesh rather than tile. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the coppery scent of blood. We need to get out of here, Jess screamed, her composure finally breaking. She took off, running down a hallway, ignoring our shouts to stay together. We heard her scream, a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly. When we rounded the corner, she was gone. The hallway ended in a solid wall, as if it had never contained a doorway at all. This isn't happening, Alex muttered, running his hands through his hair. This can't be real. But it was real, all too horrifyingly real. We pressed on, our group now down to 4, searching desperately for an exit. But it seemed the more we searched, the more lost we became. The asylum was a living maze, constantly shifting and changing around us. At one point we found ourselves in what must have been the main lobby. A grand staircase led up to the second floor, and large windows offered a view of the grounds outside. Hope surged within me. Surely we could break a window and escape. But as we approached, the view outside changed. Instead of the overgrown asylum grounds, we saw a hellish landscape of twisted trees and blood-red sky. Shapes moved in the distance, things that couldn't possibly exist in our world. Oh God, Sarah whimpered, backing away from the window. Where are we? I had a sinking feeling that we were no longer in our own reality somehow. The asylum had transported us to somewhere else, somewhere nightmares called home. We turned away from the windows only to find that the lobby had changed behind our backs. Where the entrance should have been, there was now only a blank wall. The staircase had transformed into a twisting, organic-looking structure that pulsed, and Red Mike, who had been our fearless leader at the start of this misadventure, now looked like a scared child. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "This is all my fault. I never should have." His words were cut off as the floor beneath him suddenly liquefied. He sank like a stone, his scream muffled by the churning fleshlight substance that had moments ago been solid ground. Sarah lunged for him, but Alex and I held her back, watching in horror as our friend disappeared. Now we were three. Exhaustion and terror welled within me as we continued our desperate search for escape. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Had we been in this nightmare for hours, days, the asylum toyed with us, offering glimpses of hope, odd air that looked like it might lead outside a window that showed our own world, only to snatch them away at the last second. Sarah was the next to go. We had paused to catch our breath in what looked like an old administrative office. She leaned against a filing cabinet, and before we could react, it had enveloped her. The metal twisted and warped, becoming organic, swallowing her whole. As she screamed for us to help her, Alex and I ran. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. And still the asylum tormented us. Voices whispered from the walls, some begging for help, others cackling with malicious glee. Shadows moved at the edge of our vision, always disappearing. When we turned to look, "There has to be a way out," Alex panted as we paused in yet another identical corridor. Maybe if we never finished the thought. The ceiling above him suddenly dipped down, like a giant hand pressing through soft clay. Before I could even shout a warning, it had engulfed him, leaving me alone in the pulsing, breathing hallway. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by despair. This was it. I was going to die here, swallowed up by this impossible living building. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end to come. But then I heard it, a voice different from the mocking whispers that had been haunting us. It was faint, but clear. Wake up. My eyes snapped open. The hallway around me flickered like a glitch in a video game. For just a moment, I saw past the nightmare, saw the mundane reality of a rundown, abandoned building. Wake up. The voice came again, stronger this time. I understood suddenly. This wasn't real, or at least not entirely. The asylum had trapped us in some kind of shared hallucination, feeding off our fear. But if I could break free, I closed my eyes, concentrating with every fiber of my being. Wake up, I told myself. This isn't real. Wake up. The world shattered around me. I felt a sensation of falling. And then I opened my eyes to find myself lying on the floor of the asylum's entrance. All my friends were there too, all of them groggle, sitting up and looking around in confusion. The building around us was just a building, old and creepy, yes, but not the living nightmare we had experienced. We didn't speak as we stumbled out into the cool night air. There would be time later to try to make sense of what had happened. For now, we were just grateful to be alive, to be free. As we drove away, I looked back at Ravencroft Asylum one last time in an upper window. I thought I saw a face watching us leave, a face that smiled with too many teeth before melting back into the darkness. I shuddered and turned away. We had escaped this time, but I knew the asylum would be waiting for its next victims. After all, a place like that is always hungry for more. The gentle age of the lighthouse beacon was the only sound that broke the oppressive silence of the island. I stood at the window of the keeper's quarters, watching the hypnotic sweep of light across the churning sea. It had been 4 weeks since I'd taken this job, eager for solitude and a chance to escape my troubled past. But as I stared out into the darkness, a chill ran down my spine. Something was out there, something that didn't belong in this world, and I was beginning to suspect that this lighthouse held secrets far more terrifying than anything I'd left behind. My name is Daniel Cooper, and I never intended to become a lighthouse keeper. But when life deals you a series of brutal blows, sometimes you find yourself grasping at any opportunity for escape. After losing my job, my marriage, and nearly my sanity in the span of a year, the ad for a temporary lighthouse keeper on a remote island seemed like a godsend. The job interview was brief, and conducted over the phone. The Coast Guard officer who hired me seemed more concerned with my ability to handle isolation than any specific skills. It's just for 3 months, he'd said. Maintain the light, keep the logs, and report any unusual activities. Think you can handle that? I jumped at the chance. 4 months of peace and quiet away from the chaos of my life sounded perfect. If only I'd known what I was really signing up for. The island was smaller than I'd expected, barely more than a rocky outcropping jutting from the sea. The lighthouse itself was an imposing structure, its white tower stark against the gray sky. As the boat that brought me pulled away, I felt a momentary pang of anxiety. I was truly alone now. The first few days passed uneventfully. I familiarized myself with the equipment, studied the logs left by previous keepers, and settled into a routine. During the day, I'd perform maintenance tasks and explore the small island. At night, I'd ensure the light was functioning properly and lose myself in books or my own thoughts. It was on the 5th night that I first noticed something was amiss. I was making my final check of the beacon before turning in when I saw it. A flickering light out on the water where no light should be. It pulsed with an eerie greenish glow bobbing on the waves, like some bioluminescent jellyfish. I watched it for nearly an hour, transfixed. It seemed to be moving, but not in the random way a piece of flotsam would know. This light was moving with purpose, zigzagging across the water in a pattern I couldn't quite discern. Finally, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light winked out. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, but a quick check of the log book revealed something unsettling. Similar lights had been reported by keepers going back decades, always described in the same way: greenish glow, purposeful movement, sudden disappearance. Over the next few weeks, the sightings became more frequent. Sometimes it was just one light, other times a whole cluster of them dancing across the waves like some otherworldly ballet. I found myself spending more and more time at the window, watching and waiting for their appearance. But it wasn't just the light. Strange things began happening on the island itself. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in places I knew I hadn't left them. I'd wake up to find intricate patterns drawn in the sand around the lighthouse, too precise to have been formed by wind or waves. And sometimes in the deep of night, I'd hear whispers, words in a language I didn't recognize, seeming to come from the very walls of the lighthouse itself. I tried to rationalize that all isolation could play tricks on the mind. I told myself the lights were probably just bioluminescent algae, the missing tools, the result of my own forgetfulness, the patterns in the sand formed by animals I hadn't yet seen. But deep down I knew I was lying to myself. Something was happening on this island, something beyond the realm of normal explanation. It all came to a head on the night of the full moon, exactly 3 weeks after I'd arrived. The sea was unusually calm, a mirror-like surface reflecting the swollen moon above. I was in the lantern room, polishing the lens, when I heard it, a sound like massive stones grinding against each other coming from the base of the lighthouse. Heart pounding, I made my way down the spiral staircase. The sound grew louder with each step until it was all I could hear, drowning out even the sound of my own ragged breathing. As I reached the bottom, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The floor was opening. There's no other way to describe it. The solid stone was splitting apart, revealing a yawning chasm beneath, and rising from that impossible depths was a sight that nearly drove me mad on the spot. It was a creature, if such a word can even apply to the monstrosity. I saw massive tentacles, each as thick as a tree trunk, writhed and twisted as they emerged from the pit. They were covered in pulsing bioluminescent spots, the same eerie green I'd seen out on the water. Behind the tentacles came a bulbous body, its flesh translucent enough that I could see shadowy organs pulsing within. And then I saw its eyes, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, covering its body like a horrible constellation. They all turned to focus on me at once. And in that moment, I knew true terror. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen in horror. But I couldn't move. It wasn't paralysis born of fear, but something else. The creature was holding me in place somehow, its gaze penetrating into the very core of my being, and then it spoke not with words, but directly into my mind. Images and sensations flooded my consciousness. Ancient cities beneath the waves, civilizations rise and fall, secrets of the universe, both beautiful and terrible. I saw the true purpose of the lighthouse, not as a beacon for ships, but as a signal for something far older and more powerful. I understood then that this creature, this entity, had been here long before humans ever set foot on this island. The lighthouse was built on its resting place, the key, unwitting guardians of a slumbering god. How long I stood there, my mind overwhelmed by the entity's communication, I'll never know. It could have been minutes or hours, but eventually, mercifully, it released me from its mental grip. The tentacles began to recede, slipping back into the chasm. The grinding sound returned as the floor sealed itself, leaving no trace of the horror I'd witnessed. I stumbled back up to the keeper quarters, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to flee, to swim, if necessary, anything to get off this cursed island, but a deeper part knew it was futile. I had been chosen for this. Whether I liked it or not, I was now the guardian of something ancient and powerful, something that defied human comprehension. The next morning, I made my usual report to the Coast Guard. Nothing unusual to report, I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. But what could I tell them? Who would believe me? As I sit here now writing this account, I can see the green lights dancing on. I know now what they truly are, not bioluminescent algae or strange fish, but extensions of the entity that slumbers beneath the lighthouse. They're searching, always searching for something. I can't begin to understand. My 3-month contract is almost up, but I know I won't be leaving. How can I, knowing what I know? Someone has to keep watch to maintain the lighthouse, not for the ships that pass, but for the thing that I'll stay keeping my lonely vigil. And if you ever find yourself on a ship passing a remote lighthouse, and you see strange green lights in the water, don't look too closely. Some secrets are better left in the depths, where they belong. The old camera felt heavy in my hands, its weathered leather strap rough against my skin. I'd picked it up on a whim at a flea market, charmed by its vintage look, and the sellers claimed that it still worked. Little did I know that this innocuous purchase would plunge me into a nightmare beyond my wildest imagination. As I developed the film left inside, I realized with growing horror that this camera didn't just capture moments, it captured souls. My name is Alex, and I've always been fascinated by photography. There's something magical about freezing a moment in time, preserving it forever. So when I saw the old Leica M3 at Mrs. Gillespie's stall, I couldn't resist. The price was steep, but the camera was in surprisingly good condition for its age. Oh, that old thing, Mrs. Gillespie had said, her rheumy eyes twinkling. Found in an estate sale. Previous owner was quite the traveler, they say. Bet had seen some sights. I should have asked more questions, should have wondered why she seemed so eager to part with such a valuable item. But I was too excited by my find to notice the tremor in her hand as she handed it over, or the relief in her eyes. As I walked away at home, I examined my prize more closely. The camera was indeed in, with only minor scratches on the body. To my surprise, there was still film inside. Curious to see if it would work, I finished off the roll by taking a few test shots around my apartment. I have a small dark room set up in my spare bathroom, another hobby of mine, As I developed the film, I felt a childlike anticipation. What kinds of images had the previous owner captured? What stories might they tell? The first few photos were unremarkable landscape cityscapes, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I hung them up to dry, I noticed something odd. About the next image, it showed a crowded street scene, people hurrying by, but one figure stood out, a man staring directly at the camera, his face a mask of terror. The strange thing was he seemed blurred, almost transparent, as if he was fading away. I shook my head, attributing it to a quirk of the old film, but the next photo made my blood run cold. It was a picture of a young woman smiling at the camera. Behind her, reflected in a shop window, was the same terrified man from the previous shot, only now he was even more transparent, reaching out toward the woman with a desperate expression. My hand shook as I developed the rest of the roll. Each photo was similar, normal scenes at first glance, but always with that fading figure somewhere in the frame, growing more transparent with each shot. In the final photo, taken in what looked like a graveyard, the figure was barely visible at all, little more than a wisp of smoke among the headstones. I stared at the photos for hours, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was impossible. And yet the evidence was right there in front of me. Somehow, this camera had captured a man's spirit soul. And with each photo, it seemed to be drawing him further out of this world. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, my dreams filled with fading figures and desperate silent screams. When I finally dragged myself out of bed the next morning, I was determined to uncover the truth about this camera. I started with an internet search, looking for any information about haunted or cursed cameras. Most of what I found was obviously fake stories made up for clicks or views. But buried in a forum thread, I found a post that made my heart race. My grandfather had a camera like that Leica M3, right? Get rid of it now, before it's too late. The user had deleted their account shortly after posting, but it was enough to convince me I wasn't imagining things. This camera was dangerous. I knew I should destroy it, smash it to pieces, burn the film, and forget I'd ever seen those horrifying images. But curiosity got the better of me. I had to know more. I spent the next few days digging deeper, reaching out to photography experts and paranormal researchers alike. Most dismissed me outright, but a few seemed intrigued. One historian even agreed to meet with me. Dr. Eleanor Vance was a small bird-like woman with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me. She examined the camera carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. "This is no ordinary camera," she said finally. "Where did you say you got it?" I told her about the flea market, about Mrs. Gillespie. Dr. Vance nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "There are stories," she began, her voice low, "of objects that can capture more than just light. Some believe that the right combination of materials crafted with dark intent can create items capable of trapping the human soul." I shivered. "In the photos. But why? What's the purpose?" Dr. Vance's eyes met mine, and I saw genuine fear. "Their power, Mr. Chen, the kind of power that comes from consuming the essence of others." She went on to explain her theory that the camera was designed to slowly drain the life force from its subjects, feeding it to whoever controlled the camera. With each photo taken, the victim would fade a little more from this world until they're gone completely. I finished feeling sick. Dr. Vance nodded gravely. "I would strongly advise you to get rid of that camera, Mr. Chen. Destroy it if you can. Objects like that have a way of resisting attempts to be rid of them. But you must try." I left her office with my head spinning. Part of me still wanted to believe this was all an elaborate hoax, or maybe I was losing my mind, but deep down I knew the camera was evil, and I had to destroy it. That night, I gathered everything I needed: the camera, the photos, the negatives. I drove out to an abandoned lot on the edge of town, my heart pounding the whole way. Once there, I doused everything in lighter fluid and struck a match. The flame sputtered to life, and I hesitated for just a moment. Then steeling myself, I dropped it onto the pile. The fire caught immediately, flames leaping up to consume the camera and its grisly products. I watched mesmerized as the leather bubbled and peeled, the metal warping in the heat. And then I heard it, a scream not from outside, but inside my own head, a howl of rage and pain that felt like it was tearing my skull apart. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, as visions flashed before my eyes. I saw the man from the photos, no longer fading but vibrant and alive. I saw others, 2 dozens of them, hundreds, all trapped within the camera. And I saw the one who had trapped them, a figure shrouded in shadow, consuming their essence, like a man dying of thirst. The visions faded as quickly as they had come, leaving me gasping on the ground. The fire had burned out, leaving nothing but ashes. The camera was gone. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that destroying the camera freed those trapped souls and ended the nightmare. But life is rarely so neat. Since that night I've been different. I see things others don't, flickers of movement at the corner of my eye, transparent figures that vanish when I turn to look, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear them, the trapped souls of the camera whispering to me from beyond the veil. I don't know if I'll ever be free of this curse. All I know is that I have to keep searching, keep trying to understand what happened, because if there was one camera like that out there, there might be others, and next time I'll be ready. So if you're ever at a flea market or an antique shop and you see an old camera that seems too good to be true, walk away. Some relics of the past are better left undiscovered, because you never know what might be looking back at you through that lens. The attic door creaked open, releasing a cloud of dust that danced in the shaft of afternoon sunlight. I coughed, waving away the particles, and peered into the gloom among the usual clutter of forgotten belongings and family heirlooms. A weathered leather-bound book caught my eye. Its spine was cracked, its pages yellowed with age. As I picked it up, a chill ran down my spine. Little did I know I was about to uncover a family secret that would shake the very foundations of my reality. I'm Emily, and I've always been the curious type. When my grandmother passed away, leaving me her old Victorian house, I saw it as an opportunity to delve into my family's history. The house had been in our family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter. It was a treasure trove of memories and untold stories. The attic was my last stop on my exploration of the house. I'd been putting it off, partly because of the dust, I'm mildly allergic, and partly because attics in old houses always gave me the creeps. But my curiosity finally won out. The book I found was a journal, its leather cover soft and supple despite its age. On the first page, in faded ink, was my great-grandmother's name, Elizabeth Blackwood. I settled onto an old trunk, brushing away cobwebs, and began to read. At first it seemed like a typical diary of a woman in the late 1850s. Elizabeth wrote about her daily life, her husband, her children. But as I turned the pages, the entries took a dark turn. The voices are getting louder. One entry read, "They whisper from the walls, from things, terrible things, and they want me to know them too." I felt a shiver run through me. Was this some kind of fiction, or had my great-great-grandmother suffered from mental illness? But as I read on, the entries became more specific, more chilling. They showed me today the truth behind the veil. This house, it's not just a house, it's a gateway, and we are its keepers. My hands were shaking now, but I couldn't stop reading. Elizabeth wrote about rituals performed in the basement, about sacrifices made to keep the door closed. She described creatures that defied description, beings that existed beyond our reality, but pressed against the thin barrier between worlds. The house hungered, she wrote, it must be fed, or it will open the way. And if that happens, God help us all. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. This had to be some kind of joke, right? A work of fiction my great-great-grandmother had written to pass the time. But deep down I knew it wasn't. There had always been something off about this house, the way shadows seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them, the whispers you'd hear late at night too faint to make out words, but unmistakably there. I needed to know more. I spent the next few days poring over the J journal, taking notes, trying to make sense of Elizabeth's ramblings. She wrote about a ritual that needed to be performed every full moon. About specific items needed as silver knife candles made from rendered fat. I didn't want to know what kind. And always blood. The house must be appeased. She wrote a drop of blood from the keeper freely given. It's a small price to pay to keep the horrors at bay. I found myself standing in the basement that night, Elizabeth's journal in one hand, a silver letter opener in the other. The full moon shone through the small window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. This is crazy, I muttered to myself. You're not actually considering this, are you? But even as I said it, I knew I was, because in the weeks since I'd found the journal, things had gotten worse. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent. I'd seen things moving in mirrors only to vanish when I turned to look, and last night I could have sworn I saw a door in my bedroom wall, a door that had never been there before, and was gone in the morning. With a deep breath, I pricked my finger with the letter opener. A bead of blood welled up bright red in the moonlight. I let it fall to the floor, half expecting something dramatic to happen. Nothing did, at least not at first. But as I stood there, heart pounding, I felt a change in the air. The oppressive feeling that had been building all week seemed to lift. The whispers faded to nothing. The house settled with a sigh. Like a great beast appeased, I sank to the floor, my legs suddenly weak. What have I done? I whispered, but I knew exactly what I'd done. I'd taken up the mantle of keeper just as my grandmother had, and her mother before her, all the way back to Elizabeth. I'd acknowledged the terrible truth that this house was more than just a building, that it held back horrors beyond imagination, and that it was now my responsibility to keep those horrors contained. Over the next few months, I delved deeper into Elizabeth's journal, learning the intricacies of being a keeper. I performed the ritual every full moon, watching as my blood sank into the basement floor, consumed by something I could see, but could definitely feel. I learned to listen to the house, to feel its moods. I learned to recognize the signs of when the barrier was weakening, the increase in whispers, the shadows that moved too quickly, the impossible geometries in the corners of rooms. And I learned about the consequences of failure. Elizabeth wrote about a time before she understood her role. When she'd left the house for months, she returned to find the town in chaos. People gone mad from glimpsing things they were never meant to see. It had taken all her strength and the sacrifice of something far more precious than blood to close the rift she allowed to open. I couldn't let that happen. I was the keeper now, and I had a duty to uphold. But it wasn't easy. The things I saw, the knowledge I gained, it weighed on me. I couldn't maintain relationships. How could I when I couldn't tell anyone the truth? I couldn't leave the house for long periods, not without risking another incident. My life became the house, and the house became my life. Years passed. I watched from my windows as the world changed, as technology advanced and society evolved, but inside the house time seemed to stand still. I performed the rituals, I kept the horrors at bay, and I aged now. As I write this, I'm an old woman. My hair has gone gray, my hands shake as I hold the pen. I have no children to pass this burden to, no daughter to take up the mantle of keeper. I worry about what will happen when I'm gone. Will the house find a new keeper, or will the horrors finally break through, spilling out into a world that's not prepared for them? I've done what I can to prepare. I've written my own journal, more detailed than Elizabeth's, explaining everything I've learned. I've set up a trust, ensuring the house will always be maintained, always occupied. But in the end, I know it might not be enough. The house is patient, but it's also hungry. And one day it might just decide that the small offerings we've been giving it are no longer enough. So, if you're reading this, if you found yourself in possession of a house that feels just a little too alive, pay attention, listen to the whispers, watch the shadows. And if you see a door where no door should be, Think very carefully before you open it, because some doors once open can never truly be closed again. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was when my GPS started speaking in tongues. One moment, the robotic voice was calmly directing me to take the next right. The next, it was spewing a stream of guttural sounds that made my skin crawl. I should have turned back then, should have recognized it as the warning it was, but I was tired, frustrated, and more than a little lost, so I pressed on deeper into the maze of back roads that seemed to be swallowing me whole. It wasn't until my phone died and the last rays of sunlight faded that I realized just how dire my situation had become. My name is Sarah, and I've always prided myself on my sense of direction. I'm the person friends call when they're lost, the one who can navigate a new city without a map. So when I decided to take a shortcut on my way to visit my sister, I didn't think twice about it. Even as the roads grew narrower and the houses more sparse, I remained confident I'd find my way back to the highway. Eventually, the trouble started when I hit a fork in the road not marked on any map. My GPS, which had been increasingly unreliable as I ventured further off the main roads, suddenly came to life. With that horrifying stream of inhuman language, I jabbed at my phone trying to silence it, but the sound only grew louder. More insistent. In a panic, I threw the phone into the back seat, where it continued its eldritch monologue. The silence that followed when its battery finally died was almost as unnerving as the noise had been. By now, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the unfamiliar landscape. The trees seemed to press in closer to the road, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I flicked on my headlights, but they seemed weak against the encroaching darkness. I drove on, hoping to find a town, a gas station, any sign of civilization where I could ask for directions. But the road just kept winding, taking me deeper into nowhere. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt. Still I pressed on. Fear and stubbornness wearing within me. It was full dark when my car finally gave up. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of a road that felt more like a tunnel through the woods. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there all night. With a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The silence hit me first. There were no sounds of traffic, no distant barking dogs, not even the rustle of wind through leaves. It was as if the world had been muffled, wrapped in a thick blanket of quiet. I shone my flashlight down the road in both directions, hoping to see some sign of which way to go, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead. With no better option, I started walking in the direction driving. The dirt road felt soft under my feet, almost spongy. I tried not to think about what might be making it feel that way. I'm not sure how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that oppressive darkness. But eventually I saw a light in the distance. Hope surged within me. Civilization at last. As I drew closer, I realized it wasn't the warm glow of a house or street light. It was a single bare bulb swinging gently from a post at a crossroads. The light it cast was harsh and cold, creating more shadows than it banished. I approached cautiously, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. As I reached the edge of the light's influence, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, nailed to the post, was a sign, but it wasn't giving directions or marking a town limit. No, this sign bore a single word, crudely painted in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Choose. I stood there frozen, staring at that ominous message. Choose what? And what would happen if I chose wrong? That's when I noticed them in each direction leading away from the crossroads. There was a path, but these weren't roads. Not really. They were different. To my left, a path of bones stretched out into the darkness. They clattered softly, Though there was no wind to move them to my right, a trail of mist hovered just above the ground, swirling and coiling like a living thing straight ahead. The dirt road continued, but now it pulsed faintly, as if alive. And behind me, the way I'd come was now a river of shadows flowing like water, but darker than the night around it. I felt pan-pick clawing at my throat. This couldn't be real. I must have fallen asleep at the wheel crashed. Maybe this was a dream, a hallucination. It had to be. But the chill night air on my skin felt real enough. The rough wood of the signpost was solid under my trembling fingers. This was happening. I don't know how long. I stood there paralyzed by indecision. Each path seemed more impossible, more terrifying than the last. But I couldn't stay at the crossroads forever. I had to choose in the end. I chose the path straight ahead, the living road. I don't know why, maybe because it seemed the most familiar, the closest to the normal world I'd left behind. As soon as my foot touched the pulsing earth, I felt a jolt run through me. The ground seemed to ripple, reacting to my presence. And then, to my horror, it began to move. I was pulled forward, the living road carrying me along like a conveyor belt. I tried to turn back, but my feet were stuck fast. All I could do was watch as the crossroads receded into the distance there. Swinging light growing smaller, until it was swallowed by the night. The journey that followed was a nightmare, a sensation. The road beneath me wet and undulated, sometimes smooth as silk, other times rough, and jagged shapes loomed out of the darkness, twisted trees, impossible rock formations, things I couldn't begin to describe, and always that feeling of movement, of being carried inexorably forward to an unknown destination. I lost all sense of time. It could have been hours or days. I was aware of changes, the air growing warmer, then impossibly cold, the sky above shifting through colors that had no names. At some point must have slept, or perhaps lost consciousness, because suddenly, jarringly, it was over. I found myself standing on solid ground again, blinking in bright sunlight. I was in a small clearing surrounded by normal-looking trees. In the distance, I could hear the faint sound of traffic. Relief flooded through me. I was back. I had made it through whatever that was. I started walking toward the sound of cars, my legs shaky, but cooperating. It wasn't until I reached the road, a normal paved highway, that I realized something was wrong. The cars looked odd, sleeker, more futuristic than anything I'd ever seen. And when I finally managed to flag one down, the driver looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, his accent strange to my ears too. "You mean?" I managed to ask, dreading the answer he told me. And I felt the world spin around me somehow, impossibly. I had traveled more than a decade into the future. I've spent the years since of what happened to me. I've researched quantum physics, parallel universes, every fringe theory I could find. I've sought out others who've had similar experiences. Though few believe my story, sometimes I wonder if I really did make it back, if this world with its unfamiliar technology and changed landscapes is truly my own, or if perhaps I'm still on that living road experiencing some kind of elaborate illusion. But mostly I think about that crossroads, about the choices I didn't make. What would have happened if I'd taken the path of bones, or the misty trail, or the river of shadows? Where would I be now? I may never know the answers, but one thing's for certain: I'll never take a shortcut again. Sometimes the long way around is the safest path after all. And if you ever find yourself on a dark, unfamiliar road with your GPS speaking in tongues and your phone battery dying, turn back before it's too late. The grinding of metal on metal was the first sign that our road trip was about to take a nightmarish turn. I glanced at Jenny, my fiancée, as she wrestled with the steering wheel, trying to guide our sputtering car to the side of the desolate highway. As we rolled to a stop, the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Little did we know the encroaching dark would be the least of our worries in the hours to come. What the hell was that? I asked, peering out the window. At the empty road stretching endlessly in both directions, Ginny shook her head, frustration etched on her face. I don't know, market. Just died. She turned the key in the ignition, but the engine only wheezed in response. I pulled out my phone, already knowing what I'd see. No signal. We were in the middle of nowhere, having taken a scenic route on our way to visit Ginny's parents. It had seemed romantic at the time, just the two of us on the open road now, with night falling and our car. Dead. It felt like the beginning of every horror movie I'd ever watched. Okay, don't panic, I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. There's got to be a town nearby. We passed a sign a while back, remember? Ginny nodded, her blonde hair catching the last bit of tree twilight. Yeah, Millbrook, it can't be too far. We grabbed our jackets and a flashlight from the glove compartment before setting out. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Our footsteps crunched on the gravel shoulder, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see headlights approaching, but the road remained empty, a black ribbon cutting through the darkening landscape. It was fully dark by the time we saw lights in the distance. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by a surge of unease. There was something off about the town silhouette. The buildings seemed to lean at odd angles, their proportions not quite right. Thank God, Ginny breathed, picking up her pace. Maybe we can find a mechanic, or at least a phone. As we entered the town limits, my sense of wrongness only grew. The streets were empty, no cars parked along the curbs, no people visible anywhere, yet lights glowed in every window, warm and inviting. The effect was eerie, like walking onto an abandoned movie set. We made our way down what appeared to be the main street, our eyes darting from building to building. There was a diner, its neon open sign buzzing faintly, a small grocery store, shelves visible through dusty windows, a gas station pump standing like silent sentinels. Hello, Ginny called out, her voice echoing off the buildings. Is anyone here? We need help. No response, just that unnerving silence. Let's try the diner, I suggested, pointing to its cheery facade. There's got to be someone in there. As we approached, I could see MOV inside, shadows passing behind the windows, the vague outlines of people seated at booths. Hope surged within me, finally some signs of life. But when I pulled on the door, it didn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, but it was like trying to move a solid wall through the glass. I could still see people inside going about their business, as if we weren't there at all. What the hell, I muttered, peering through the window. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The people inside, they weren't quite right. Their movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and their faces, I couldn't make out any features. It was as if they had smooth blank ovals where faces should be. I stumbled back, grabbing Ginny's arm. We need to go now. What did you see? She tried to look for herself, but I pulled her away. Trust me, we don't want to be here, I said, my voice shaking. This place at its wrongness. If in response to my words, the town seemed to come alive around us, not in a good way. The buildings began to shift and warp their angles, becoming even more impossible. The street lights flickered, casting wild shadows that moved independently of anything around them. And then we saw the people, if you could call them, that began emerging from them. Buildings, they moved with that same jerky gait I'd seen in the diner, their featureless faces turned towards us. They didn't speak, didn't make any sound at all, but their intent was clear. They were coming for us. We ran back the way we came, towards the edge of town, and our broken down car beyond the entities followed their footsteps, a discordant rhythm behind us. I did dare look back, afraid of what I might see. As we reached the town limits, I felt a shift in the air, a pressure like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The town was folding in on itself. Buildings twisted and merged, streets rippled like water, and the entities pursuing us were changing too, their forms blurring and stretching in ways that defied physics and sanity alike. We kept running, our lungs burning, legs aching, the highway stretched out before us, our car a distant silhouette in the moonlight behind us. The sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by a low, ominous hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Just as we reached the car, the world blinked. There's no other way to describe it. One moment we were running for our lives from an impossible nightmare town. The next we were standing next to our car on an ordinary stretch of highway, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon. We stood there gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had happened. The town was gone, no lights in the distance, no sign it had ever existed at all. Did that really happen? Jenny asked, her voice small and shaky. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I tried the car door, half expecting it to be locked. It opened easily. The key was in the ignition right where we left it. With a trembling hand, I turned it. The engine roared to life as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. We drove in silence, both of us too shaken to speak. As the sun rose, painting the sky in pinks and golds, I began to wonder if it had all been some kind of shared hallucination. Maybe we both fallen asleep in the car, had the same nightmare. But then Jenny reached out, taking my hand in hers. Your knuckles, she said softly. I glanced down. My knuckles were scraped raw, as if I'd been pounding on a door that wouldn't open. We drove straight through to Jenny's parents' house, making no more stops along the way. We never talked about that night, not really. How could we explain it even to ourselves? But sometimes late at night, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that low hum ringing in my ears. And I'll wonder, what if we hadn't made it out? What if somewhere in that twisted, impossible town there are two more entities wandering the streets, their faces smooth and blank, trapped in an endless, surreal nightmare? I don't take unfamiliar roads anymore. I stick to the main highways, the well-traveled paths. And if I ever see a small town appearing out of nowhere as night falls, I'll keep driving, no matter how inviting the lights might seem, no matter how badly I might need help, because some places, once you enter, you might never truly leave. So, if you're ever on a long drive and you find yourself on a lonely stretch of road as darkness falls, be careful, watch the horizon. And if you see lights appear where no town should be, don't stop, don't even slow down, just keep driving and hope that whatever lies behind those lights doesn't decide to follow you home. The first thing that struck me about Everdale was the silence as I hiked deeper into the valley. The usual sounds of the wilderness, birdsong, rustling leaves, the scurry of small animals faded away, replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums. I should have turned back, then should have recognized that damnable trait that had led me into trouble more times than I could count urged me forward. Little did I know I was walking into a trap. Centuries in the making. My name is Jake, and I'm what you might call an urban explorer with a twist. I seek out not just abandoned buildings or forgotten tunnels, but entire lost communities, ghost towns, failed utopias, places wiped off the map by disaster or simply the passage of time. It was this passion that led me to the rumors of Everdale. The story went that sometime in the late 1800s, a group of settlers had founded a community deep in the mountains, isolated from the rest of the world. They'd thrived for a while, but sometime in the early 1900s, all contact with the outside world had ceased. Expeditions sent to investigate found nothing, no buildings, no bodies, not so much as a rusty nail to show that humans had ever lived there. It was exactly the kind of mystery that set my pulse racing. I spent months researching, piecing together fragments of information from old newspapers, land records, and local legends. Finally, I thought I had pinpointed the location of the lost settlement. The hike was grueling. The terrain was rough, the trail often disappearing entirely, forcing me to rely on my map and compass. But as I crested a final ridge and looked down into the valley below, I felt a surge of triumph. There, nestled among the trees, I could see the unmistakable signs of human habitation, buildings, fields, even what looked like a church spire rising above. The canopy, my elation was short-lived, however, as I descended into the valley. That unnatural silence fell, bringing with it a sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, and color seemed muted, as if I was looking at the world through a faded photograph. Still I pressed on. I had come too far to turn back now. As I entered the outskirts of the town, the wrongness intensified. The buildings looked off somehow. Their proportions were slightly skewed. Angles that should have been straight were subtly curved. It was as if the entire town had been built by someone who had only a vague idea of what buildings should look like. And then there were the people. I saw the first one as I passed what appeared to be a general store. A man dressed in clothes that looked straight out of the 19th century was sweeping the porch. He moved with an unsettling fluidity, his motions too smooth to be natural. As I approached, he turned to look at me, and I had to stifle a gasp. His face was wrong. The features were their eyes, nose, mouth, but they seemed to shift and blur, never quite settling into a fixed arrangement. It was like trying to focus on a face underwater, constantly distorted by ripples and waves. "Welcome, traveler," he said, his voice oddly melodious. "We've been expecting you." A chill ran down my spine. How could they have been expecting me? I hadn't my expedition. "I'm just passing through," I managed to stammer out. "I didn't mean to." What might have been a smile. "Nonsense, you're right where you're meant to become. The others will want to meet you." Before I could protest, more people began to emerge from the buildings around us. Men, women, children, all dressed in antiquated clothing, all moving with that same unnatural grace, all with those shifting, blurring faces. They surrounded, rising in a cacophony of greetings and exclamations. I felt dizzy, overwhelmed by their presence and the wrongness of it all. "Please," I said, trying to back away. "I should go. I have to get back." A woman's voice cut through the noise. The crowd parted, revealing a figure that made my blood run cold. She was tall, impossibly so, her head nearly brushing the roof of the nearby porch. Her face was the most defined I'd seen yet, but it was a face that belonged in nightmares, too angular, too symmetrical, with eyes that seemed to glow from within. "There is no back, dear Jake," she said, my name rolling off her tongue like she'd known it all along. "Your home." Now I ran. I don't remember making the conscious decision to do so, but suddenly I was sprinting down the town's main street, my heart pounding in my ears. The buildings blurred as I passed, seeming to twist and reach for me with impossible angles behind me. I could hear them pursuing, their footsteps, a terrible rhythm that seemed to shake the very ground. I dared not look back, afraid of what I might see. I reached the edge of town, expecting to see the forest I'd walked through earlier. Instead, I found myself facing a shimmering, translucent barrier. Beyond it, I could see the trees, the mountains, the world I knew, but it was like looking through warped glass, everything distorted and strange. I pressed my hands against the barrier, desperately seeking a way through. It felt solid yet yielding, like pushing against a membrane. With a surge of effort, I managed to force my way through the barrier, stretching and then snapping back behind me like a rubber band. I didn't stop running until I reached my campsite, my lungs burning, legs shaking with exhaustion. Only then did I dare to look back. The valley was empty, no town, no fields, no church spire reaching towards the sky, just wilderness, untouched and serene. I packed up my gear with shaking hands and hiked out, not stopping until I reached my car. As I drove away, I tried to convince myself it had all been some sort of hallucination. Maybe I'd eaten some bad trail mix, or the altitude had gotten to me, but deep down I knew the truth. What I'd seen in that valley was real, as impossible as it seemed. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. I found more stories, accounts from other explorers who'd stumbled upon Everdale over the years. Some had fled as I had, others hadn't been so lucky I learned about the town's origins, how it had been founded not by ordinary settlers, but by a group practicing a strange esoteric form of magic. They had sought to create a place outside of time, a sanctuary where they could live forever unchanging, and they had succeeded after a fashion, but their magic had twisted them, trapped them in a half-life of endless repetition. The people I had seen weren't the original settlers, but something else, echoes perhaps, or manifestations of the town's own warped consciousness. I discovered that Everdell doesn't exist in one fixed location. It moves, appearing in different wilderness areas across the country. Always isolated, always waiting for unwary travelers to stumble upon it. Sometimes late at night, I dream of that shimmering barrier in my dreams. I don't make it through. Instead, I'm pulled back into the town, surrounded by those shifting faces, those two fluid bodies. The tall woman smiles at me, welcoming me home. I wake from these dreams in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and for a moment, just a moment, I see my own face in the shifting like theirs. I don't go hiking anymore. I've given up my urban exploration, my quest for lost places. Some things I've learned are better left unfound. Some communities disappear for a reason. But I can't help but wonder about Everdell. Is it still out there waiting for its next victim? Are the people I saw still going about their endless routines, trapped in a moment that stretches for eternity? And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the world grows quiet, I swear I can hear them calling to me, welcoming me home. So if you're ever hiking in the wilderness and you come across a town that's not on any map, a place that seems too perfect, too preserved, run, and don't look back, because Everdell is always waiting, always hungry for new residents. You may never leave again. The scratching sound from the attic was so faint at first, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, but as the days wore on, it grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to claw its way out, or perhaps more terrifyingly, and I told myself it was just the house settling, maybe square swills in the eaves. But deep down I knew something was up there, something that didn't belong. And it was only a matter of time before I'd have to face it. My name is Lisa, and I'd always dreamed of owning a big old house. So when I landed a job in a small town upstate and found a beautiful Victorian going for a steal, I jumped at the chance. Sure, it needed some work, but that was part of the charm. I imagined myself slowly restoring it to its former glory, uncovering its secrets room by room. The first few weeks were blissful. I threw myself into cleaning and minor repairs, reveling in the creaky floorboards and ornate moldings the previous owners had left behind, some furniture and knickknacks, which I planned to sort through eventually. For now, though, I was content to let the house reveal itself to me gradually. It was about a month in when I first heard the scratching. I was up late one night reading in bed, said, when the sound caught my attention, soft, rhythmic, coming from somewhere above me. I held my breath, listening intently. As it had started the next night, I heard it again. And the night after that, always after dark, always when the house was at its quietest. I tried to ignore it, to rationalize it away. Old houses make noises, right? It's perfectly normal. But the sound grew louder, more frequent. Sometimes I'd hear it during the day, now a frantic scrabbling that would send me rushing to the attic access in the hallway. But every time I opened it and shone a flashlight up into the darkness, I saw nothing, no animals, no signs of habitation, just dust and old boxes left by previous owners. I started having trouble sleeping. Every creak, every groan of the house settling had me sitting bolt upright in bed, my heart racing. Dark circles appeared under my eyes, and my coworkers started asking if I was feeling all right. It was about 2 months into my stay when things escalated. I woke one night to a tremendous crash from the attic. It sounded like something heavy had been toppled. Overgathering my courage, I grabbed a baseball bat and climbed the narrow stairs to investigate. The beam of my flashlight danced over piles of boxes and old furniture. At first I saw nothing amiss, then my light fell on an overturned trunk, its contents filled across the floor, old clothes, yellowed papers, and something else, something that made my blood run cold. It was a doll, antique and eerily lifelike. Its porcelain face was cracked, one eye missing, but its remaining eyes seemed to stare right at me. I approached cautiously, my skin crawling. As I got closer, I noticed something clutched in the doll's hand, a piece of paper, old and brittle. With trembling fingers, I pried it free. It was a photograph. Septatone and faded, it showed a family standing in front of a house, my house. I realized with a start, a man, a woman, and between them, a little girl holding a doll, the same doll that now lay at my feet. I flipped the photo over. On the back, in spidery handwriting, was written, "The Coopers in 1997. Emily always did love that doll." A chill ran down my spine. I looked back at the doll, and for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn its eye moved, focusing on me with malevolent intent. I bolted, slamming the attic door behind me, and not stopping until I was back in my bedroom, door locked and lights blazing. Sleep was impossible that night. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. The next day I threw myself into researching the house's history. I discovered that the Coopers had been the original owners. They'd lived there happily for years until tragedy struck. Their daughter Emily had fallen ill and died at the age of 8. The parents had moved away shortly after, unable to bear the memories. As I dug deeper, I found whispers of darker things, rumors that Emily hadn't simply died, but had been the victim of some sort of ritual gone wrong, that her parents had dabbled in the occult trying to cure her illness, and had instead unleashed something terrible. That night the scratching was louder than ever, but now it wasn't just coming from the attic, it seemed to be in the walls, under the floorboards, all around me, and mixed with it so faint I could almost convince myself I was imagining it was the sound of a child's laughter. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and fled to a hotel, planning to put the house on the market as soon as possible. But as I lay in the sterile hotel room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something unfinished, that by running away I was condemning the next owners to the same fate. After a sleepless night, I made a decision. I had to go back, had to face whatever was in that house, and put an end to it. I returned the next evening, armed with sage, holy water, and every protection charm I could find. As I approached the house, I could feel its malevolence, like a physical weight pressing down on me inside. Everything was as I had left it, but the air felt thicker, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I made my way up to the attic, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The doll was where I'd left it, its one eye gleaming in the beam of my flashlight. But now, instead of fear, I felt a surge of anger. This thing, whatever it was, had no right to be here. This was my house now. "Emily," I said, my voice shaking only slightly, "I know you're here. I know what happened to you. But it's time for you to move on." The temperature in the attic plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs, and frost began to form on the windows. The doll's eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, and then I saw her, a shimmering, translucent figure of a little girl in an old-fashioned dress. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and filled with a mixture of loneliness and rage. "You can't make me leave," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "This is mine home. My dolly is here." I steeled myself, fighting against the urge to flee. "No, Emily, this isn't your home anymore. You've been here too long. It's time to let go," she screamed. Then a sound of pure anguish that shook the very foundations of the house. Objects began to fly around the room, narrowly missing me. The doll rose into the air, its cracked face contorting into a grotesque smile. I don't know where I found the strength, but I stood my ground. I began to recite the prayers and incantations I'd memorized, my voice growing stronger with each word. I sprinkled holy water and lit the sage filling the attic with pungent smoke. Emily's form flickered, her scream turning to a wail of despair, the its remaining eye popping out and rolling across the floor. And then suddenly it was over. The temperature rose, the flying objects dropped, and Emily's spirit seemed to dissolve like mist in sunlight. In her place, I saw a brief image of a smiling, healthy girl who mouthed a silent thank you before fading away completely. I sank to my knees, exhausted but triumphant. The house felt different now, lighter somehow. The oppressive energy that had filled it was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. In the days that followed, I had the doll and all of Emily's remaining possessions properly buried in the local cemetery. I finished resto in the house, no longer afraid of what I might uncover sometimes late at night. I still hear noises from the attic, but now instead of scratching, it's the gentle creak of floorboards, as if someone is walking around up there. And sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of a little girl in an old-fashioned dress, smiling and playing. I don't fear these occurrences. Instead, they fill me with a sense of warmth, because I know now that this house isn't just mine, it's a home for both the living and the memories of those who came before. And as long as I'm here, Emily will never be forgotten or alone again. The vintage camera felt heavier in my hands than it should have, as if it carried the weight of untold stories within its metal casing. I'd stumbled upon it at a dusty flea market, drawn by its retro charm, and the sellers claimed that it still worked perfectly. But as I peered through the viewfinder for the first time, a chill ran down my spine. The world through that lens wasn't quite right. Shadows seemed deeper, colors more vivid, and in the corner of the frame, I could have sworn I saw a figure that wasn't there. When I lowered the camera a little, did I know the seemingly innocuous purchase was about to plunge me into nightmare, where reality and the supernatural blurred like an overexposed photograph. My name is Michael, and I've always been fascinated by photography. There's something magical about capturing a moment in time, freezing it forever. So when I saw the old Leica M3 at Mrs. Donovan's stall, I couldn't resist. The price was steep, but the camera was in surprisingly good condition for its age. Oh, that old thing, Mrs. Donovan had said, her rheumy eyes twinkling. Found it in an estate sale. Previous owner was quite the artist. They say captured things nobody else could see. I should have paid more attention to the way her hands shook as she handed it over, or the relief in her eyes as I walked away. But I was too excited by my find to notice. At home, I examined my prize more closely. The camera was indeed in excellent shape, with only minor scratches on the body. To my surprise, there was still film inside. Curious to see if it would work, I finished off the roll by taking a few test shots around my apartment. I have a small dark room set up in my spare bathroom, another hobby of mine. As I developed the film, I felt a childlike anticipation. What kinds of images had the previous owner captured? What stories might they tell? The first few photos were unremarkable landscapes, cityscapes, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I hung them up to dry, I noticed something odd about the next image. It showed a busy street scene, people hurrying by, but one figure stood out, a woman staring directly at the camera, her face a mask of terror. The strange thing was she seemed blurred, almost transparent, as if she was fading away. I shook my head, attributing it to a quirk of the old film. But the next photo made my blood run cold. It was a picture of a park I often visited. In the foreground, everything looked normal, but in the background, partially hidden behind a tree, was a figure, tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face was blurred, but I could make out what looked like a wide, leering grin. My hand shook as I developed the rest of the rule. Each photo was similar, normal scenes at first glance, but always with some nightmarish figure lurking in the background. In the final photo, taken in my own living room, the entity was front and center. Its face was clearer now, a twisted parody of human features. Its eyes dark pits that seemed to stare right through me. I stared at the photos for hours trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was impossible. And yet, the evidence was right there in front of me somehow. This camera was capturing things that shouldn't exist, things that lurked just beyond the edge of normal perception. That night I barely slept. I tossed and turned, my dreams filled with shadowy figures, and that leering inhuman grin. When I finally dragged myself out of bed the next morning, I was determined to uncover the truth about this camera. I started with an internet search, looking for any information about haunted or cursed cameras. Most of what I found was obviously fake stories made up for clicks or views, but buried in a forum thread, I found a post that made my heart race. The Leica M3 serial number 70358. If you have it, get rid of it now, before they notice you. The user had deleted their account shortly after posting, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. I checked the serial number on my camera, 70358, exactly the same. I knew I should destroy it, smash it to pieces, burn the film, and forget I'd ever seen those horrifying images. But curiosity, that dangerous, irresistible force, propelled me forward. I had to know more. I spent the next few days digging deeper, reaching out to photography experts and paranormal researchers alike. Most dismissed me outright, but a few seemed intrigued. One historian even agreed to meet with me. Dr. Eleanor Vance was a small bird-like woman with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me. She examined the camera carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. "This is no ordinary camera," she said finally. "Where did you say you got it?" I told her about the flea market, about Mrs. Donovan. Dr. Vance nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "There are stories," she began, her voice low, "of objects that can capture more than just light. Some believe that the right combination of material crafted with dark intent can create items capable of revealing the hidden world that exists alongside our own." I shivered, remembering the terrifying figures in my photos. But why? What's the purpose? I saw a genuine fear. Their power, Mr. Davidson, knowledge of things beyond our understanding. But it comes at a price. Those who peer too long into the abyss often find the abyss peering back. She went on to explain her theory that the camera was designed to gradually thin the veil between our world and whatever lay beyond. With each photo taken, the barrier weakened, allowing these entities to push further into our reality. "I would strongly advise you to get rid of that camera, Mr. Davidson," she said. "Destroy it if you can. Objects like that have a way of resisting attempts to be guarded, but you must try." I left her office with my head spinning. Part of me still wanted to believe this was all an elaborate hoax, or maybe I was losing my mind, but deep down I knew the camera was a window to something terrible, and I had opened it that night. I gathered everything I needed: the camera, the photos, the negatives. I drove out to an abandoned lot on the edge of town, my heart pounding whole away. Once there, I doused everything in lighter fluid and struck a match. The flame sputtered to life, and I hesitated for just a moment. Then, steeling myself, I dropped it onto the pile. The fire caught immediately, flames leaping up to consume the camera and its grisly products. I watched mesmerized as the leather bubbled and peeled the metal, warping in the heat. And then I heard it, a scream, not from outside, but inside my own head, a howl of rage and pain that felt like it was tearing my skull apart. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, as visions flashed before my eyes. I saw the entities from the photos, no real. I saw the world as they saw it, a place of shadows and decay where humanity was nothing but prey. And I saw myself through their eyes, a beacon of light in their dark world, a doorway they were determined to keep open. The visions faded as quickly as they had come, leaving me gasping on the ground. The fire had burned out, leaving nothing but ashes. The camera was gone. But as I staggered to my feet, I realized her growing horror that it wasn't over. The world around me looked different. Shadows seemed deeper, colors more vivid, and at the edge of my vision, I could see them, the entity watching, waiting. I ran to my car, drove home in a panic. But they followed. I see them everywhere now, in reflections in the corner of my eye, sometimes bold enough, me grinning those terrible grins. I write this as a warning. If you ever come across an old camera, especially a Leica M3 with the serial number 70358, leave it be. Don't let curiosity get the better of you, because once you've seen what lies beyond the veil, you can never unsee it, and they'll never stop watching you. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear the click of a shutter, and I wonder, am I still taking photos, capturing moments of a world I was never meant to see, or am I the one being captured now? My soul slowly fading away like those terrified figures in the photographs. I don't know if I'll ever be free of this curse. All I know is that I have to keep running, keep hiding, because in this new reality I stumbled into, I'm no longer the photographer, I'm the subject, and the entities behind the lens are always hungry for more. The fog rolled in like a living thing, tendrils of mist creeping across our lawn and enveloping the house in an eerie white shroud. At first, we thought nothing of it, fog, but as hours turned into days, and the mist showed no signs of dissipating, an unsettling realization began to dawn on us. This was no ordinary weather phenomenon. The fog was alive, sentient, and it was slowly closing in on us, bringing with it horrors beyond our wildest imagination. I'm Tom Sullivan, and until a week ago, I led a perfectly ordinary life with my wife Sarah and our 2 kids Emily and Max. In our suburban home, we were the typical American family: weekend barbecues, movie nights, and the occasional argument over whose turn it was to prepare us for the nightmare that was about to unfold. It started on a Tuesday morning, I remember, because I was running late for work, cursing under my breath as I fumbled with my tie. Sarah called out from the kitchen, "Tom, come look at this fog. It's so thick, I can barely see the driveway." I glanced out the window, and sure enough, a dense white mist had settled over our neighborhood. It was unusual, but not alarming. I kissed Sarah goodbye, told the kids to behave, and headed out to my car. As I opened the front door, the fog seemed to pulse, recoiling slightly before surging forward again. I paused, a chill running down my spine. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw shapes moving within the mist, twisted, elongated forms that disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, shaking off the unsettling feeling. I got in my car and drove to work. The fog thinned as I got further from our neighborhood, and by the time I reached the office, it was a bright, clear day. But when I returned home that evening, the fog was still there, thicker than ever. Our house sat like an island in a sea of white, the mist lapping at the edges of our property like waves on a beach. Sarah met me at the door, her face pale with worry. "It hasn't lifted all day," she said, "and Tom, I think I saw something out there over dinner." We tried to keep things normal for the kids' sake, but I could see the tension in Sarah's eyes mirroring in my own unease. After we put Emily and Max to bed, Sarah and I sat in the living room watching the fog press against our windows. "We should leave," Sarah said suddenly. "Pack up the kids and go." I nodded, relieved that she had voiced the thought I'd been too afraid to suggest first thing in the morning out, and I agreed. But morning never came. We woke to darkness, the fog so thick it blotted out the sun. Our phones had no signal, the TV only static. When I tried to start the car, the engine sputtered and died, as if smothered by the mist. That's when the whispering started. At first it was so faint we thought we were imagining it, but as the day wore on it grew louder, more insistent voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking in languages we didn't understand, occasionally broken by sounds that might have been laughter or screams. The kids were terrified. We huddled together in the living room, telling stories and playing games, trying to pretend everything was normal. But we couldn't ignore the shadows that moved past our windows, the scratching sounds on the roof and walls. On the third day, we saw them for the first time. Emily was the first to spot it. "Daddy," she whispered, pointing at the window. "There's a man out there." I looked where she was pointing and felt my blood turn to ice. It wasn't a man, not really. It was vaguely humanoid, but too tall, too thin, its limbs bending at impossible angles, its face, if you could call it that, was a swirling mass of fog with two pinpricks of light where eyes should be. As we watched, frozen in horror, more shapes emerged from the mist. Some were like the first twisted parodies of human form, others were different bulbous tentacle things that slithered across our lawn, winged creatures that flitted through the fog, their shrieks sending shivers down our spines. "We need to block the windows," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm to my own ears. "Board them up now." We worked feverishly, using anything we could find: bookshelves, dressers, planks torn from the deck outside, all the while the entities in the fog watched us, their not quite faces pressed against the glass. For days, we huddled in our boarded-up house, rationing our dwindling food supplies, jumping at every creak and groan. The whispering never stopped, growing louder and more frantic with each passing hour. On the fifth day, they tried to get in. It started with gentle taps like raindrops on the roof, then scratching, clawing sounds from every direction. The boards over the windows shuddered under impacts from things we couldn't see. We retreated to the basement, barricading the door behind us. Sarah held the kids close, singing softly to drown out the sounds of our home being torn apart above us. I don't know how long we stayed down there. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness. But eventually the noises stopped. An eerie silence fell, broken only by our ragged breathing. After what felt like hours, I gathered the courage to check upstairs. Sarah begged me not to go, but we both knew we couldn't stay in the basement forever. I crept up the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. But when I opened the basement door, I was met with nothing. That the house was intact. The boards still covered the windows untouched. There was no sign of the violent entry we had heard. Confused and wary, I made my way to the front door. With trembling hands, I removed the barricade and turned the knob. The fog was gone. Sunlight streamed down on our quiet suburban street. Birds chirped. The lawnmower hummed in the distance. It was as if the past week had never happened. Calling to Sarah that it was safe, I stepped outside, blinking in the bright light. Our neighbors were out too, looking as dazed and confused as I felt. Some fog hum. Mr. Johnson from next door called out, trying to sound casual, but unable to hide the tremor in his voice. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, because while everything looked normal, I could feel it, a change in the air, in the very fabric of reality. The fog had receded, but it hadn't gone. It had seeped into our world, thinning the veil between what we knew and whatever lay beyond. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers. We tried to go back to our normal lives. Sarah and I returned to work, the kids to school. We never talked about what happened, not even among ourselves. It was easier to pretend it had all been some shared delusion, a mass hallucination brought on by tainted water or gas leak. But we all knew the truth. We had glimpsed something that we were never meant to see, and it had changed us irrevocably. Now I find myself constantly on edge, watching the horizon for any sign of mist. I've started stockpiling supplies in the basement, food, water, weapons, just in case, because deep down I know it's not over. The fog will return, and next time boarding up our windows might not be enough to keep the horrors at bay. So if you ever wake up to find your world shrouded in an unnatural mist, don't dismiss it as a quirk of weather. Listen for the whispers, watch for the shapes that move just at the edge of your vision. And whatever you do, don't let them in, because once the fog has touched you, you'll never truly be free of it. It's always there, waiting in the shadows, ready to roll in and reclaim what it believes is rightfully its own. And in those quiet moments between sleep and waking when the world seems soft and unreal like, and subscribe for 4.